In 1967, Will Durant published the 10th of 11 volumes on the story of civilization, Rousseau and Revolution. Will Durant writes, "Our aim was to write integral history, to discover and record the economic, political, spiritual, moral, and cultural activities of each civilization in each age as interrelated elements in one whole called life. As we articulated, our purpose was to humanize the narrative with studies of the protagonists in each act of the continuing drama. While we acknowledged political matters, our true interest lay in the history of the mind, the processes of thought, the formation and propagation of ideas. These were, to us, the driving forces. Our research was not limited to written sources, we sought experience. We traveled the world twice and explored Europe unnumbered times. We saw art in its original settings, heard the music in its proper context, and sought understanding at the source. We recognized that we could not explore every economic and political detail with equal depth. We had to accept limits and acknowledge our limitations. We found ourselves exhausted on reaching the French Revolution. Our integral and inclusive method led us to give to most of these volumes a burdensome length. It was a lifelong ambition. But if we managed to elude the Reaper for another year or two, we hope to offer a summarizing essay on the lessons of history. This would turn out to be the 11th edition of this series. Each volume and chapter in this series can be listened to independently. You can sit back and watch the story unfold, or skip to the sections that resonate most with the events around you. The following is a comprehensive summary of the story of civilization, Rousseau and Revolution, highlighting its finest moments. Chapter 1, Rousseau Wanderer, 1712 to 1756. The Confessions. Rousseau, born poor, motherless, abandoned by his father, riddled with disease, dealt a losing hand from the jump. He went against the grain, repudiating the Enlightenment thinkers of his time, Voltaire, Diderot. He was exiled, suspected, but when he died he became even more influential. His autobiography, The Confessions, was where he laid himself bare. He said, "Here is the sole human portrait, painted exactly after nature in all truth, that now exists or that will probably ever exist." Homeless, 1712 to 1731. Born in Geneva in 1712. Family of French origin, a watchmaker father. His mother died a week after he was born. His father disappeared for 6 years and then came back for reasons unknown. Rousseau called himself the sad fruit of this return. He grew up on a mix of love stories, Plutarch's Lives, and Calvinist morality, a recipe for instability if there ever was one. He was at once haughty and tender, a character effeminate and yet invincible. In other words, a mess, but a mess with potential. His father brawled, fled the city, and married again. Rousseau and his brother, abandoned again, were sent to a boarding school, which he considered insignificant trash. He was whipped by a teacher he was in love with. He experienced a degree of sensuality mingled with the smart and shame, and from then on he was always prevented from being very enterprising with women, so that he passed his days languishing in silence. He was essentially a masochist in a man's body. This is exactly what makes his story unique. Punished for something he didn't do, he learned to dissemble, to rebel, to lie. All the vices common to our years began to corrupt our happy innocence. And then, at 15, he ran off, with nothing but the clothes on his back. He became a wanderer. Maman, 1729 to 1740. He met a priest who sent him to Madame de Warens, a woman who was 29 at the time, pretty and wealthy, and took him in. He called her Maman, and he became intensely attached to her. She was also a convert to Catholicism, who was more concerned with the rules than what they represented. She employed him, gave him books, and eventually, she became his lover, without prejudice. It took him 8 days to agree to become her lover, because he loved her like a son would a mother. After this relationship, he was still drawn to the wilderness, but when he finally returned to his second affair, Annecy, she left him shortly after. Rousseau went on a walk, met some women, and suddenly began to move past his feelings for Madame de Warens. He walked to Lausanne, Neuchâtel, Bern, and then he walked to Lyons, then returned to her, where he became her secretary. Here she has another lover, and Rousseau becomes friendly with the lover too. There was a strange polygonal romance, as Will Durant calls it. There was a union which rendered us mutually happy, and which death alone could dissolve. After her lover Annette dies, he takes over her business affairs. He teaches music and spends time with his maman again, until she falls sick and he nurses her to health. Afterwards, he was disturbed by the vapors and thought he had a polypus near his heart. He then has an affair with Madame de Larnage. He returns to his maman and discovers that she has a new lover, a wig maker. He was upset. She called him childish. He resumed the role as a son and then retired to her cottage, where he took up philosophy. Here, Rousseau discovered the Enlightenment thinkers and lost his religion. Instead, he believed in pantheism, believing nature to be identical to the divine. Lyons, Venice, Paris, 1740 to 1749. Rousseau became a tutor in Lyons. He was a bad teacher, he had the knowledge, and he was gentle, but he was also too volatile. He was then offered a job as secretary at the French embassy in Venice, where he also fell in love with Italian music and Italian girls. After being dismissed, he returned to Paris and presented his side of the matter to officials and was rejected. He then started copying music for a living and decided to get a mistress, Thérèse Levasseur, a laundress. He declared to her that I would never either abandon or marry her. She was simple, not charming, and mentally adolescent. They had 5 children, all sent to foundling asylums. He confessed this to Diderot, Grimm, and Madame d'Épinay. He later admitted this explicitly in his confessions and felt remorse. Shortly after, Rousseau began working on an opera for Voltaire, and this is how his famous enmity began. Civilization, a disease. In 1749, Diderot was imprisoned. Rousseau visited him. On one walk, he saw a contest that asked, "Has the restoration of the sciences and the arts contributed to corrupt or to purify morals?" He went into a violent emotional state where he believed he had the answers. He felt, "Man is by nature good, and that only our institutions have made him bad." This thought became his life's work. Diderot encouraged him to attack civilization, which he did. He won a prize at the Dijon Academy. This discourse on the arts and sciences became a sensation. He argued that all progress had replaced simple virtues with the hypocrisy of savoir-faire, that literature is an element of decay, that philosophy was destructive. He made a big claim. The invention of printing was one of the greatest disasters in the history of mankind. He revered the savages of America and argued that luxury, profligacy, and slavery have been in all ages the scourge of our pride, and nature would have preserved us from science. He made it clear that civilization is not an ascent of man, but the fall of man. Some said that he was putting on an act, some said he meant every word. Will Durant believes this essay was a needed chastisement of Parisian society. He received a barrage of criticism, and, to mark his withdrawal from society, he donned the simple garb of the middle class. Paris and Geneva, 1750 to 1754. Rousseau became ill with his bladder ailment, confined to his bed for 6 weeks. He resigned from his job and started copying music for a living. He also gave a child away to the asylum. Then, in 1752, his opera Le Devin du Village was a massive success, and he was supposed to meet the king for a pension, but his bladder problem prevented him. He got 150 louis instead. He also started working on articles on music for the encyclopedia, but these were heavily criticized. He also got involved in the musical culture war of the French versus Italian opera, where he took the Italian side. He wrote that opera was a way of reuniting all the charms of the beaux-arts. At this time he was portrayed in pastel, and Diderot said it was unfair to the truth. He had become more of an outcast, more of a rebel, and he denounced the atheism of the group, saying that atheists deserved eternal hell. He was always angry, and his friends had started to annoy him. So he went to Geneva, was welcomed, and was reinstated as a citizen. He was impressed with their kindness. He returned to Paris promising to go back soon, and this is when he resumed his friendship with his friends. He was now thinking about his second discourse, The Crimes of Civilization. Rousseau entered another contest in 1753 to answer, what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? His contribution, entitled Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, was a scathing indictment of civilization. He dedicated it to the Republic of Geneva, flattering their system, but this did not mean he was being truthful. He argued all economic, political, social, moral inequalities are unnatural and arose when men left the state of nature. His core idea, man is naturally good which becomes bad through social institutions. He pictures man in the state of nature as healthy, strong, and quick, and he contrasted this natural health with diseases engendered by wealth. His words, a thinking man is a depraved animal. He admits that this state of nature never existed, and that it is just a standard of comparison. The first society was the family, and this was man's best time until private property arose, which was the accident that cursed us all. He asks, should we therefore go back to savagery? His answer is no. He just wants to study the Gospels and cleanse our evil impulses through Christianity. Will Durant remarks that this all sounds artificial. He notes that there is an underlying debate. Are the evils from corrupt institutions or from the nature of man? He says that Rousseau's conception of primitive nature was of course a romantic idealization, and that what he wanted was to return to the patriarchal family cultivating the soil, the conservative. Rousseau then wrote an article, Discourse on Political Economy, in which he seemed to betray his previous ideals. He lauded society, government, and law. He declared private property to be a sacred right. He also stated, nothing is more fatal to morality in the Republic than the continual shifting of rank and fortune among the citizens. He also notes that men should pay taxes based on their possessions. He also advocates for a system of national education. He talks of general will, the idea that society has its own spirit that is above the needs of the individuals who make up said society. He now believed that virtue is the conformity of particular wills with the general will. Will Durant speculates that the editors of the encyclopedia cautioned him to moderate his attack upon civilization. Escape from Paris, 1756. Grimm, Diderot, and Madame d'Épinay were now his closest friends. Grimm was a German, a very French German. He was educated at Leipzig and had a strong grounding in Greek and Roman literature. He came to Paris and started writing articles for Le Mercure. He loved music, which led him to Rousseau, but he was more taken by Fell, who rejected him. He then entered a depressive state. He recovered from this and started taking advantage of Rousseau's hospitality. He also met with Diderot and started the Nouvelle Littéraire, a collection of articles that were sent to those outside of France. He wrote all sorts of things, some heavily anti-Christian. Grimm had no problems criticizing people, even Voltaire, and he had a hint of the pride and vanity that irritated Grimm's friends. He also spent hours grooming himself. He was more Gallic than the Gauls. Then comes Louise Florence Tardieu d'Esclavels, who was a kind, sweet, and generous woman. Her husband was not. He was a gambler, a drinker, and had many affairs. He gave his wife syphilis, and they separated. She took care of her children and nursed her friends. Her friends thought she needed a lover. One came, but it ended badly. Grimm was introduced to Louise by Rousseau. He defended her in a debate and was wounded in a duel. Soon afterwards, she was exonerated. She thanked him and they began a love affair. Grimm was then away, and when Louise asked who would defend her if she was attacked, he responded, "The same as before, your past life." Rousseau described his friend Madame d'Épinay as agreeable enough in mixed company but uninteresting in private. She was also thin and had a bosom like the back of her hand. She decided to help Rousseau, so she fixed up a cottage for him, named L'Ermitage, which he immediately loved. She knew that he wanted to return to Switzerland. Rousseau moved in with Therese and her mother. On April 9, 1756, I began to live. But Grimm warned her, solitude will complete the work of blackening his imagination. Rousseau, A mess of contradictions, a symphony of pain, but a life that changed everything. This is just the beginning of his story. Chapter 2. The 7 Years' War. How to start a war. By 1756, Europe was like a cage of tigers who hadn't fed properly. The War of the Austrian Succession had left everyone feeling uneasy. Austria, under Maria Theresa, was still bitter about losing Silesia. Prussia was hungry for more power, Britain for trade. The old balance was broken, the tension was tangible, and religious conflicts, both sides waited for some turn of chance to renew the 30 Years' War for possession of the European soul. All this waiting made it only a matter of time before another European bloodbath. Maria Theresa, fueled by her Habsburg pride and the humiliation of defeat, was determined to reclaim Silesia. She, when it seemed that events were conspiring to ruin her, caught the spirit of government and became the soul of her council. She went to work retooling her government, her armies, and her diplomacy like a master craftsman, seeking out any means of regaining what was taken from her. Her agents scoured the world for allies, playing the game like chess, stirring up trouble and hostility against Frederick. Maria Theresa would gladly have renewed her alliance with England, but that had been soured by England's separate peace with Prussia, which had compelled Austria to surrender Silesia. On September 30, 1755, England signed a treaty that bound Russia in return for English subsidies to maintain 55,000 troops in Livonia. These, the English hoped, would deter Frederick from any expansionist adventures to the west. Meanwhile, England had its sights set on defeating France, the only other real player in the game. William Pitt the Elder, the most forceful orator that body had ever heard, was advocating for an alliance with Prussia, modern-day Germany. It seemed wiser to let Protestant Prussia replace Catholic France or Catholic Austria as the dominant power on the continent, if that would let Britannia rule the waves and capture colonies. It was a simple power grab, wrapped in nationalistic ambitions. So, on January 16, 1756, Frederick signed the Treaty of Westminster to ally with the Brits. France, Austria, and Russia were livid. Austria viewed England's move as a betrayal. Maria Theresa, as she informed the British ambassador, was shocked to learn that her English friends had signed a pact with the mortal and constant enemy of my person and my family. Louis of France remembered that Frederick had ridiculed the barnyard morals of the French king. On May 17, 1756, England declared war on France. This marked the beginning of the 7 Years' War. The Outlaw, 1756-57. Frederick tried to rope Saxony in by bribing them with Bohemia, but it didn't work. He then went and seized Saxon archives for evidence, and once secured, published his enemy's plans for the world. Maria Theresa claimed the documents as fakes. She called France and Russia to unite against Prussia, and they came running to save the world from Frederick. France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, Poland were all allied against Frederick. England and Prussia were all that was left of the opposition, and now even England was getting doubtful. England was starting to look like a weak force, seeing that their state of Hanover was completely defenseless, but then William Pitt stepped in. A France victorious against Frederick would be master of Europe, and soon of England too. He knew that they couldn't back down now, so England sent money to Frederick, but Pitt's sudden dismissal delayed things, and Frederick had to stand alone. On the very day that Pitt fell, Frederick became an outlaw. The emperor branded Frederick as an outlaw, ordering all good men to come forward to stop this menace from walking free. From Prague to Rossbach, 1757. Frederick sent secret instructions to his ministers stating, "If I am killed, affairs must continue without the slightest alteration. If I have the bad luck to be captured, I forbid the smallest consideration for my person or the slightest attention to anything I may write in captivity." He set out to dismantle threats to the throne. He led the attack on Prague against 61,000 Austrians. A general named Leopold von Daun came to Frederick and forced Frederick to break off the siege, losing 14,000 Prussians. They pulled back to re-strategize at Leitmeritz. And when, on July 2nd, Frederick hears word that his mother has died, even the great and formidable Frederick broke down. He tried to get help by offering bribes through the people he knew, but his allies sniffed at his potential for victory. Everyone knew they had Frederick trapped in their web. Everything was coming apart. A French army of the Dauphin was entering Germany. Another army, defeated at Hastenbeck, led to the surrender of Hanoverian troops to the French, and on the same day he got this message of defeat, he was informed of an additional Russian force had landed and ravaged East Prussia, his homeland. Frederick at this point seemed weak. To me, the enchantment of life is ended, the charm disappears. I see that all men are but the sport of destiny. Frederick needed a battle that would prove once and for all life or death. On the 5th of November, Frederick won that crucial battle that broke the spirits of the combined French army, and all that by losing merely 550 Prussian men, whereas the Allied forces lost 7,700. His military genius was on display again. England started to throw a bone his way and celebrated him for his achievement, making the alliance stronger once more. The Fox at Bay, 1757-60. On December the 5th, the battle at Leuthen occurred, which led to 20,000 captured Austrians. The world at the time called it unprecedented. Napoleon even said it was a masterpiece. After this victory, Frederick pressed hard. He went straight into Breslau, took that and other strongholds before they could establish a true defense. France had enough and started to seek peace, while the French army showed a total lack of enthusiasm for the war, being recalled because they were ineffective. England then renewed their pledge and sent Frederick more resources. His troops now had become something of a debt collection agency. They taxed everything and used it for the state. By spring 1758, Frederick was able to raise his army once again to 145,000. 50,000 Russian soldiers invaded East Prussia, and after he heard of this, he headed to defend. On the way he got news his sister, Wilhelmine, was critically ill. "O you, dearest of my family, preserve yourself, and let me have the consolation of shedding my tears on your breast." The making of the British Empire. The real fight wasn't on the battlefields of Europe, it was happening across the Atlantic in North America and India. This is where empires were made and won. This war would give an immeasurable edge to whoever came out on top. The Brits defeated the French Navy, cutting the lifeline between France and its colonies. With that domination on the Atlantic, they went on to the North American theater. The colonies at the time were split. England had colonies on the east, and French forts stretched all the way from Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. These territories effectively cut off any westward expansion, and it was because of this the British went in and got into wars. By the surrender in Quebec of the French governor Vaudreuil, the British conquest of Canada had become clear. They didn't stop at the cold north and went for French holdings in the Caribbean, taking a few key islands that included Guadeloupe 1759 and Martinique 1762. They didn't only target the Caribbean, they took slave trading stations and killed France's business and slaves on the west coast of Africa as well. The prices went up and British slave merchants rose to become the next dominant slave dealers. It is no surprise that they came to control it first, as their navy and ability to move around was leaps ahead of their competition. The French attempted to take Madras in 1759, and this was a decisive battle where they were decimated. It was obvious that after that last holdout, all that the French had was just there because the English said so. Exhaustion and peace. After all the battles, most countries were depleted. Prussia most of all was drained beyond belief, not one stone untouched in the fires of war. Austria could barely stand up and needed Russia again for support. The French Navy was gone, and England was starting to realize that they had so many assets to protect, they could fall into a defensive strategy. The war had lasted 7 years. Frederick got to keep what he took: Silesia and Glatz, the same amount of land he took from Maria when all the bloodshed had begun, with Wesel and Gelderland remaining his as well. He didn't even need to give land up to anyone. When he was getting congratulated, he replied that the happiest day of his life would be the last one. Frederick went from a threat to an outcast to now the hero. He won it all in this long war, where most would not have survived. The 7 Years' War ruined Austria, for all its debts were piled on her and their reign over their once holy Roman Empire was no more. Germany rose under the power of Prussia with all of its patriotism and nationalism under Frederick. This move gave way to Goethe and Schiller's emergence. Sweden did not get any wins. Russia, with 120,000 men down, was the big game changer in this, giving birth to a modern version of the country as well as setting up an eventual partition of Poland. France went to ruin with commerce gone and debts at record numbers. For England, victory. Their empire has been born, and no one would rise up against it. But Prussia was just about broken. Cities burned, villages decimated, 500,000 Prussians dead. Frederick paid the price as well, being aged at the end of the ordeal he had gone through. Frederick went into Berlin after 6 years of fighting and stated, "Long live my dear people, long live my children." Frederick knew the thousands upon thousands of kids whose deaths were for a plot of land. His back was bent, his face and figure lean and drawn, his teeth lost, his hair white on one side of his head, his bowels racked with colic, diarrhea, and hemorrhoids. "But for this campaign," said Grimm, "I should never have conceived how far the horrors of poverty and the injustice of man can be carried." The war helped and hurt religion, as many felt God was not with them in this horrific trial they went through, while others became more pious because they believed good would win in the end. Chapter 3. The Marquise departs. The figure of Madame de Pompadour emerges as a formidable operator, yet her influence was destined to wane. For a time, her personal charm held the king in sway, even as the nation grieved. However, following Damien's attempt on the king's life January 5, 1757, Louis XV of France, experiencing a sudden religious awakening, directed her to depart at once. Her removal from and subsequent return to power highlights the volatile nature of courtly influence. A moment of vulnerability can swiftly displace even the most entrenched figures. She wielded considerable control over ministers and generals, utilized the Bastille to suppress dissent, and inevitably amassed personal wealth, a common practice. This woman was indeed a major player in a high-stakes game, yet she failed to grasp a fundamental rule: one can never truly manage or control the progression of fortune. The court, as well as the populace, harbored resentment towards her, decrying her as that prostitute who governs the kingdom is bringing it to ruin. Her public appearances in Paris became untenable, a classic instance of power devoid of genuine respect. She herself is quoted as having said, "I am quite alone amidst this crowd, who loathe me and whom I despise. As for most of the women, their conversation gives me a sick headache. Their vanity, their lofty airs, their meannesses, and their treacheries make them insupportable." Remarkably, she managed all of this while contending with health issues. Voltaire characterized her death as the end of a dream. The entire episode provides a compelling lesson in the acquisition and loss of power. The recovery of France. Let us now turn to the broader state of the nation. High taxation, neglected lands, and widespread peasant starvation paint a typical portrait of a failing system. The focus on resource extraction had effectively bankrupted the country. However, despite these challenges, a recovery did ensue, a noteworthy observation. They rectified the damage inflicted by the elites by distributing seed and constructing roads. Thus, a process of self-healing began. Will Durant notes, English carding machines were introduced about 1750, and toward 1770 the jenny, working 48 spindles at once, began to replace the spinning wheel in France. The French were quicker to invent than to apply, for they lacked the capital that England, enriched by commerce, could use to finance mechanical improvements in industry. Access to capital, it is clear, is paramount. Joseph Cugnot employed the steam engine in 1769 to operate the first known automobile. A year later, this was employed to transport heavy loads at 4 miles an hour. However, the machine got out of hand and demolished a wall. Internal trade was hampered by tolls, external trade by war and loss of colonies. A significant shift in economic power occurred as the basic economic development in 18th century France was the passage of preeminent wealth from those who owned land to those who controlled industry, commerce, or finance. Yet the landed elite, still wealthy, continued to assert their dominance based on birthright. This resulted in a juxtaposition of the poorest and richest segments of the population, the physiocrats. The physiocrats advocated for reduced trade restrictions and greater competition, believing it would stimulate production and, consequently, wealth. This was an ideology of free competition. Land is the source or material from which wealth is extracted, and only the earth produces true wealth. This position led to a strong focus on agriculture. This led to the inception of the famous principle that came down to inspire and plague the Russian Revolution, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. This concept holds profound relevance even in contemporary discourse. The rise of Turgot. While initially intended for a career in the priesthood, his intellectual curiosity was evident. His father held a high position as a state councillor, the highest administrative office in Paris. He mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Spanish, Italian, German, and English, and his erudition allowed him to deliver compelling lectures, characterized as historic enunciation of the new religion of progress. His central claim was, knowledge is power. He argued that animals are static, whereas man accumulates and builds upon knowledge over time. This is key, as he himself said. Colonies are like fruit, which clings to the tree only until it is ripe. By becoming self-sufficient, they do what Carthage did, what America will sometime do. He had a vision of the future. This statement alone holds more weight than many standard teachings of his day. He was also an economist and laid the groundwork for the capitalist systems of the 19th century. On July 20, 1774, a new king invited him to join the central government. All France rejoiced. And he would put the place on proper footing for its future, a significant event to consider. The king. Louis XV seemed primarily interested in passing amiably from bed to bed, an extravagant display. Lacking the will of his predecessor, he grew apprehensive and deferred decisions to others. "Things as they are will last through my time," he is quoted as saying, indicating an attitude of neglect. Du Barry. The narrative of Du Barry is indeed compelling. A common girl who ascended to the position of royal mistress, she went from nothing, spent time in a convent, indulged in various affairs, and moved from a pimp's party hostess to enjoying the full luxuries of France. Her path to power. It is noted that the king had these thoughts upon their initial meeting. He was struck by her voluptuous beauty, her gaiety and playfulness. Here was someone who could amuse him again, and warm his cold and melancholy heart. The revolt of the Parlement. This is about the ongoing struggle for power in France. The Parlement sought to control the crown, but it always came down to the reality that the sovereignty belongs to the king alone. He is accountable only to God. On January 5, 1757, Robert François Damiens attacked the king in a Versailles street and stabbed him with a large penknife, and Damiens claimed that, "I had no intention to kill the king. I might have done this had I been so inclined. He merely wanted to touch his king's heart." As history often does, his actions resulted in a torturous public execution. Highborn ladies paid for points of vantage from which to see the operation. The king departs. Finally, Louis XV's reign concluded. Sick and afflicted with pox, he only conceded his mistakes on his deathbed. It is claimed that he could not bear to think of death. He knew that France was awaiting his demise, which he did all he could to postpone. Ultimately, this is what occurred. "Never in my life," he told his daughter Adelaide, "have I felt happier." He passed away on May 10, 1774, aged 64, having reigned 59 years. His body was quickly interred without ceremony, amid the sarcasms of the crowd. Chapter 4. The Art of Life. Morality and Grace, a Study in Contrasts. The assertion of Talleyrand that the 1780s marked the pinnacle of pleasure for the upper classes, particularly those not bothered by rigid morals, speaks volumes about the era. French morality at this time appeared, for many, to be a construct easily bent to personal inclination. Frenchmen, through centuries, had often relieved monogamy with adultery, akin to how America might relieve it through divorce. In the Gallic view, judicious adultery inflicts less harm upon the family, or at least upon the children, than does divorce. The sanctity of marriage was, for some, treated with an alarming casualness. The presence of a mistress was elevated to a status symbol, much like the possession of a fine carriage or an expensive timepiece. Love itself was often regarded merely as the flesh, in the words of Buffon, devoid of the deeper connections one would normally expect. Diderot, in his Encyclopédie, distinguished bind from attach with the following statement: "One is bound to one's wife, attached to one's mistress." This reveals a disconcerting social hierarchy where the mistress appeared to hold more esteem than the wife herself. One might indeed say that certain sections of the French elite operated on a plane so distant from what might be deemed reasonable. Some attempts were made to bring order to this situation, but the task proved akin to trying to halt a surging tide with a bucket. Jean-Jacques Rousseau undertook in this age a solitary crusade for the reform of morals. Nonetheless, certain women found solace in chastity and premarital virtue, using this adherence to a strict moral code as an escape from the depravity of their reality. However, within this seeming chaos of conduct, one could still glimpse pockets of integrity. One found instances of men demonstrating loyalty within their marriages, wives enduring their husbands' transgressions out of a deeper attachment. Such cases provided a different perspective into the nature of these relationships. The faithfulness of Mile Crozat to the Duke of Richelieu while he pursued her sister, and the devotion of the Duchess of Richelieu to her errant husband, suggests a potential for genuine affection, no matter how rare. It is perhaps curious that the legal system held such peculiar priorities. While sodomy was punishable by death, adulterous nobles enjoyed considerable license and impunity. And, like any epoch, there were those, such as one might find today, who secured offices through influence or wealth and enriched themselves beyond the bounds of proper behavior. Despite these excesses, the poor did receive some alleviation through acts of charity. In essence, this society seemed composed of people possessed with certain virtues, yet captivated by the pursuits of pleasure and prestige, and possessed, perhaps, by a measure of haughtiness. The French style of politeness was described as such. The French are so polite, so obliging, that one feels drawn to them at once, it was observed, yet the same observer added that trust in them was seldom secure. This tension between charm and reliability speaks to a complex dynamic. They cared about presentation. Hairdressers made fortunes by changing hair fashions frequently. Cleanliness did not extend to the female hair, for this took hours to arrange, and all but the fanciest women kept the same hairdos for days without disturbing them with a comb. And women carried their cosmetics with them, and renewed their complexions in public as brazenly as today. This all to say that these actions of focus showed their value placed on aesthetics over substance. Their pursuit of entertainment that involved promenading in public spaces at the early hours is telling about how little they focused on other matters, detached as they were from the rhythms of work that occupied common people. Marmontel, Women, Wit, and a Moral Tale. The figure of Jean-François Marmontel epitomized this epoch's characteristics. His ascension in society owed much to the backing of influential women, his wit, and the sponsorship of Voltaire. He became a lion in the salon as his connections opened many paths in his journey. Marmontel's publications were written in the style of a fairy tale. Their popularity cemented him in culture. This also caused issues with religious establishments because he wrote about topics promoting tolerance. In truth, those moral values have always been, but in this instance it is considered an important note on what was truly going on at the time. Come, sir, is it not the spirit of the age, not mine, that you are condemning? His life as a public figure was a clear show of the priorities at this time before his retirement. Chapter 5. The Good Lord. Will Durant begins by detailing Voltaire's acquisition of an estate at Ferney in 1758, situated strategically near the Swiss border. This was no mere pursuit of tranquility, rather, it was a calculated maneuver. Voltaire was adept at positioning himself, both physically and politically. He sought to maintain his options, to subtly defy the Calvinists in Geneva, all while remaining sufficiently close to escape the Catholic authorities in Paris. Securing the property under his niece's name, who then acted as the de facto mistress, he erected a 14-bedroom mansion, reflecting his self-awareness as an individual of consequence, well prepared for guests, establishing his home as a center of influence. More than simply a land purchase, Voltaire built a self-sufficient domain. His stables teemed with animals, his fields were fruitful, and he cultivated trees, transforming a barren landscape into a wealth of resources. Mesdames. Denis, well-intentioned but with a keen eye for monetary gain, presided over the household staff while Voltaire oversaw the broader operations. Her delight in his praise is noted, juxtaposed against her evident lack of talent outside of household management and acting. Voltaire's estate became a destination for visitors, both eminent and otherwise, including some unwanted guests to whom he would lie lamely, "Tell them I am very sick, tell them that I am dead. My God," he wrote to the Marquis de Villette, "deliver me from my friends, I will take care of my enemies myself." Voltaire, often described as sick half his life, and like Rousseau were brothers under the skin because of a condition they both suffered from. He refused to trust doctors, proclaiming, "Who ever heard of a centenarian doctor?" He trusted his own knowledge. Voltaire saw the necessity of economic growth in the community, establishing infirni and tournay shops for watchmaking and the weaving of stockings. He gave employment to all who asked for it, until he had 800 persons working for him. More than a mere thinker, he acted as a catalyst for commerce, his production echoing his dedication to achievement. Consequently, he employed both Catholics and Protestants, treating his vassals well. He talked with his peasants as if they were ambassadors, displaying his shrewd awareness not to stumble while building his wealth. Voltaire once remarked, "Give me a fair chance," he wrote to Richelieu, "and I am the man to build a city." The scepter of the pen. Voltaire's literary output was staggering. In 1768 alone, he produced 5 books, 2 comic operas, and a play, in addition to his regular poetry. Voltaire was the greatest historian as well as the greatest poet and dramatist of his time. His investment in letters, as well as time for conversation with people, and the value he placed on these exchanges is evident. As the recipient paid the postage, Voltaire sometimes spent 100 livres for the mail that he received in one day. His letters were passed from hand to hand as nuggets of news and gems of style. For it was in his letters that Voltaire's style reached its fullest brilliance. Unlike the witty sections in his history books, he held his best witty retorts only for conversations. He is so clear. He goes directly to the point, to the vital spot of an idea. His ideas carried significant weight and impact. Even the most powerful people were invested in his thoughts. Kings kept up consistent communications with him. These men of status would always defer to his ideas and opinions. "Frederick," declared Voltaire, "the most malign and most seductive man of genius who has ever been or ever will be in this world." Although his interactions with royalty were derided by many, this did not weaken him from playing his game, for he was warring not against the state but against the Catholic Church. Voltaire, Politicus. Voltaire set forth on practical objectives. Reform, not revolution, was what he perceived for his country. And let us face reality, those who preach about revolution are mostly peasants, or the majority those with little to their names. His money is very interesting to observe, because it was acquired from talents, not inherited, which he acknowledged with pride. "I derive 60,000 livres of my annual income from France. I admit that I am very rich." You must be economical in your youth, and you find yourself in your old age in possession of a capital that surprises you, and that is the time when fortune is most necessary to us. He, being the son of a notary who then became a seigneur, gave him a good look at all the different tiers of society. The honest answer is, because men are rarely worthy of governing themselves. He understood that democracy only works in very safe environments. And he gave an apt observation about chickens and what they can show of monarchy. A farmyard exhibits the most perfect representation of a monarchy. There is no king comparable to a cock. Voltaire's respect for action, will, and logic, which makes any government based on people not that effective because of emotion and their lack of education in understanding governance. His stays in Berlin and Geneva provided Voltaire with some context into what is meant by a monarchy and democracy. Actually, the democracies in Switzerland and Holland were oligarchies. His early days, when he was unsympathetic with the lowest classes, slowly shifted as he grew older and became more receptive with others' needs, for change is necessary. His base principles stayed true, but time evolved his views. I like to see free men make the laws under which they lived. To be free, to have only equals, is the natural life of man. Voltaire here showed his principles, constant improvement and never stagnating, and it greatly contrasted what he advocated earlier in life. His prior life and viewpoints skewed his opinions in his initial years, but as his life carried on, his understanding evolved with his changing perceptions. Post-1769, Voltaire gave a negative evaluation of governmental tyrannies and abuses in France, and praised England by comparison due to the amount of freedom the country held. These rights are entire liberty of person and property, freedom of the press, the right of being tried in all criminal cases by a jury of independent men, the right of being tried only according to the strict letter of the law, and the right of every man to profess, unmolested, what religion he chooses. Which was in contrast to the lack of liberties held within his own nation. Yet, instead of an upheaval from below, where ability to destroy would not be followed by ability to rebuild, his goal was that changes would occur. Through enlightenment, passing from thinkers to rulers, ministers and magistrates, to merchants and manufacturers, to artisans and peasants. The reformer. He advocated for abolishment of capital punishment as barbarous and wasteful. This was also his observation of children hung because of stealing. The French, who are considered, I know not why, to be a very humane people, are astonished that the English, who have had the inhumanity to take all Canada from us, have renounced the pleasure of using torture. Voltaire himself. The level of learning the man underwent during his life was immense, which ranged from politics, history, philosophy, theology, and biblical criticism. Never elsewhere has one mind transposed into literature and action so extensive a mass of materials from such a diversity of fields. He was neither perfect in the body or the soul. He was restless. He seldom knew peace of mind or body. He had to be busy, active, buying, selling, planting, writing, acting, reciting. He loathed boredom. In a bored moment he maligned life as either ennui or whipped cream. He loved money as the root of his security. He has always stayed true to what he wanted. As soon as the slightest danger comes up, kindly notify me, so that I may disown my writings in the public press with my habitual candor and innocence. Vanity became his own source of gasoline, since usually Voltaire kept his vanity under control. When he could not and was willing to adapt, he frequently revised his writings according to suggestions and criticism offered in good spirit. Jealousy would make him double his effort. Never resting, just like a cornered predator. I know how to hate, he said, because I know how to love. When I see Christians cursing Jews, methinks I see children beating their fathers. His legend was a result of how he operated in his life and what is shown as the only way one should live. They saw him grow out of hostility into benevolence, and they thought of him now as the glory of France before the literate world. This was the man whom even the populace would acclaim when he came to Paris to die. Chapter 6. In the Hermitage, 1756-57. Rousseau relocated to a cottage known as the Hermitage, provided by Madame d'Épinay. Initially, he embraced the tranquility of nature, finding solace in the sounds of birds and rustling trees. This initial period, however, did not endure, as Rousseau was not suited for prolonged peace. He possessed an overthinking mind, which soon brought him to the issue of his relationship with his companion, Therese. He himself stated, the man who thinks should not ally himself with a wife who cannot share his thoughts. This declaration revealed a stark truth about their relationship. While she offered loyalty and physical intimacy, it was a connection that lacked the profound spiritual resonance Rousseau craved. He further elaborated, "What will the reader think when I tell him that from the first moment in which I saw her, until that wherein I write, I have never felt the least love for her, that I never desired to possess her, and that the physical wants which were satisfied with her person were to me solely those of the sex, and by no means proceeded from the individual?" The situation was further complicated by Therese's mother, creating a common familial conflict. Though he provided financial support, he was met with constant demands. Additionally, they secretly arranged an annuity for themselves behind his back. Rousseau reacted strongly to this perceived undermining of his self-respect, expressing his sentiments in a letter to Madame de Panay. I want my friends to be my friends and not my masters, to advise me but not to try to rule me, to have every claim upon my heart but none upon my liberty. Madame de Panay, however, dismissed his complaints. Oh, leave these petty complaints to the empty-hearted and empty-headed. This response indicated her disdain for his perceived whining and emotionality. He engaged in various projects and read Voltaire's poem about the Lisbon earthquake. Rousseau's reaction was that Voltaire, despite his success, complained about misery. He wrote, Voltaire, while he appeared to believe in God, never really believed in anything but the devil, since his pretended deity is a malicious being who, according to him, has no pleasure but in evil. The glaring absurdity of this doctrine is particularly disgusting from a man enjoying the greatest prosperity, who, from the bosom of happiness, endeavors to reduce his fellow creatures to despair. Rousseau further wrote, Early death, such as came to Lisbon's children, may be a boon. In any case, it is unimportant if there is a God, since he will recompense all for unmerited suffering. Voltaire, dismissive of these arguments, simply invited Rousseau to visit the break with the Philosophers. At Montmorency, Rousseau took on a more humble demeanor. He referred to himself as a competent artisan, a step down from his previous lifestyle. He boasted about his titled friends, knowing how important it was to manage his reputation. However, he also refused their invitations. Saint-Lambert instructed his mistress to avoid further interaction with Rousseau, leading Rousseau to conclude that Diderot was the source of this babble in the salons. He declared war, which was an imprudent decision given the timing. His first assault came in, he stated, I had an Aristarchus, severe and judicious. I have him no more. I want no more of him, but I shall regret him unceasingly, and my heart misses him even more than my writings. In a footnote, he added, If you have drawn a sword against a friend, don't despair, for there is a way to return it to him. If you have made him unhappy by your words, fear not, for it is possible to be reconciled with him. But for outrage, hurtful reproach, the revelation of a secret, and the wound done to his heart by betrayal, there is no grace in his eyes, he will go away from you and never return. He wrote, You speak to me of that man Voltaire. Why does the name of that buffoon sully your correspondence? That miserable fellow has ruined my country. I would hate him more if I despised him less. I only see in his great gifts something additionally shameful, which dishonors him by the use he makes of them. O citizens of Geneva, he makes you pay well for the refuge you have given him. Voltaire responded by calling him a charlatan, madman, little monkey, and miserable fool. Voltaire continued his attacks. He writes against the stage after having written a bad comedy himself. He writes against France, which nourishes him. He finds 4 or 5 rotten staves from the barrel of Diogenes and climbs into them in order to bark at us. He abandons his friends. Chapter 7. The Social Contract. Rousseau, according to Durant, initially presented himself as weary of authorship. He declared a desire to retreat from public life, yet soon after unleashed his influential work, The Social Contract. This apparent contradiction set the stage for his complex ideas. He spoke of his perceived decline in wisdom after taking up the pen. Rousseau posited a natural state where man was free, with governments acting as the chains binding that liberty. This led him to propose his social contract, not an agreement with a ruler, but an accord of all to submit to the general will of the community. According to Rousseau, this contract would defend and protect and allow man to remain as free as before. He believed that this general will was not merely the preference of the majority, but rather a public spirit reflecting the long-term goals and traditions of a community. Rousseau considered the government a temporary manager of the general will, not its master. He argued that even a monarchy could embody a republic if it was governed by just laws. Concerning property, Rousseau's stance seemed, according to Durant, conflicted. While expressing disapproval of private property, he simultaneously dismissed revolution as chaotic. He maintained the existence of private property while also attempting to impose a communal control over it, thus limiting the accumulation of wealth. His aim, according to Durant, was a prosperous, independent peasantry that would promote the bourgeoisie. Rousseau himself admitted that my ideas are consistent, but I cannot expound them all at once. Those who pride themselves on thoroughly understanding the social contract are cleverer than I am. Love, marriage, and a final note. Rousseau's views on sex, marriage, and the role of women. Rousseau believed that sex should not be discussed until the children asked about it, but that it should also never happen since the children are to be pushed by experience. He wanted the children to avoid brothels as that is where temptations and danger lie. He believed that marriage was better to avoid temptation. According to Durant, he despised domineering women and preferred modesty and to have the men in charge. He believed that a woman's place is in the home, as among the ancient Greeks. He argued that women should accept their husbands as masters, but they should also be supreme in the home. According to him, girls should learn domestic skills and religion, also to follow the men's direction in society as the husband. They should stay away from philosophy and should not be seen as solitaire. However, they should also be lively and eager, but they are never to be let loose since the proper study of womankind is man. Rousseau believed that a young man should find his perfect girl, and after choosing this woman, the couple should be separated for 2 years to test their loyalty. They were then expected to live happily ever after. Chapter 8. Rousseau Outcast. Exile. Rousseau's publication of Emile ignited a firestorm of controversy with both the church and the government. Unlike others who might have sought anonymity, Rousseau placed his name on the work, becoming a target for authorities. His friends urged him to flee, and he narrowly escaped imprisonment. As decrees went out to seize him, he absconded from the city. The said book shall be torn and burned in the court of the palace, at the foot of the grand staircase, by the high executioner. All those who have copies of the book shall deliver them to the register, to be destroyed. No publisher shall print or sell or distribute this book. All sellers or distributors thereof shall be arrested and punished according to the rigor of the law. And J.J. Rousseau shall be apprehended and brought to the conciergerie prison of the palace. Upon crossing into Switzerland, he reportedly kissed the ground, as if escaping a land of utter oppression. His troubles were compounded by his earlier expulsion from Geneva. Voltaire, attempting a gesture of goodwill, offered shelter, but Rousseau declined, convinced that Voltaire had sabotaged him. The affair devolved into a tangle of accusations and inflated egos, a common side effect of success. After being expelled from Bern as well, he found himself under the protection of Frederick the Great. Ironically, even Frederick provided him with funds, not as charity, but as a recognition of his influence. Rousseau in turn implored Frederick to be the greatest of men while also pointing out, "Your subjects don't have food." Rousseau's conflict with the archbishop. Even in relative calm, Rousseau found himself embroiled in further conflict. Church leaders publicly denounced him as a heretic, while his vicar attracted attention, particularly from women. To defend himself, Rousseau began writing his confessions. The Archbishop of Paris, in a formal mandate, condemned Rousseau as a bold and proud blasphemer, an impious calumniator swollen with arrogance, a lover of pleasure rather than God. He further declared Emile to contain a very great number of propositions false, scandalous, full of hatred against the church and her ministers. A constitution for Corsica. When Corsica gained its independence, the island sought Rousseau's help in drafting its constitution. He advocated that every citizen should sign a solemn and irrevocable pledge of himself, a vision with some parallels to communism. He further advised that Corsica should avoid trade and industry, focusing solely on agriculture, and claiming that the state should be the sole owner. The French occupation of Corsica led Rousseau to denounce the very idea of it. A life of flight. Rousseau continued to be a target for the church, while villagers, seeking a sense of satisfaction, threw stones at his residence. He retreated to a remote island, a choice that some viewed as passive. After a life of running away, an acquaintance withdrew his invitation to stay, prompting him to declare, "It is that it should please them for me to pass the rest of my days in prison." After some deliberation, his friends arranged for him to travel to England, where he was met with enthusiasm. When he arrived, he quickly became the center of attention. Rousseau in England. In England, Rousseau enjoyed a kind of celebrity. He received invitations from royalty, reserved seats at the theater, and even a financial annuity. One of his benefactors described him as amiable and virtuous. "He is gentle, modest, affectionate, disinterested, of exquisite sensitivity, but also as a veritable child." A woman from France was brought over to manage his more difficult behaviors. They began an affair, and Rousseau declared it affair till after her death, or that of the philosopher. Drama ensued when letters arrived from his secret group. His friends had been trying to manipulate him for his own good, which prompted him to leave his new home. The series of events drove him into a state of paranoia. He finally abandoned England and returned to France, leaving his belongings behind and disappearing. Chapter 9. Italia. Felix. The landscape. Italy geographically presented a dichotomy. The north possessed a fertile landscape, its vines a testament to the land's potential. Sloping terrain was terraced to hold the earth, and vines were hung from tree to tree, garlanding the orchards. Here, the land offered abundance. Conversely, the south suffered from poor soil. This disparity contributed to a fragmented economic and social landscape. The peninsula, often contested by foreign powers, was governed by those who possessed the strength to seize and maintain control. It was noted that half-conquered, half-despoiled, Italy, at least in the north, was the happiest country in Europe. Queen of the Adriatic, Venice. Venice, once a significant power, was experiencing a period of political and economic decline, having lost its Aegean empire to the Turks. The city, with a population of 137,000, adopted a policy of strict governance, characterized by political censorship and personal supervision. However, they did not expand into free enterprise. The state regulated matters concerning ecclesiastical property and clerical crime, and tolerated regulated prostitution as a measure of public safety. Venetian society was known for its indulgence in entertainment and gambling. The city's carnival was a period of revelry and lawlessness. Despite this, the exhausted revelers would return to their legal beds and prepare to face their religious obligations. Within this city, there was the practice of training homeless children in vocal and instrumental music. Chapter 10. Portugal and Pombal. John V, 1706 to 1750. The narrative of Portugal in this era presents a study in decline. Once a nation of explorers whose ships charted the globe and established colonies from Brazil to India, it had, by the 18th century, become a comparatively small presence on the European stage. How had this occurred? A primary factor was complacency. The influx of gold from Brazil, rather than spurring domestic growth, created a dependence on external sources, particularly England. Instead of developing their own industries, they traded precious metals for finished goods, placing themselves in a subordinate position. The effect of this dependency was a stagnation of domestic industry. The nation's economic priorities became skewed, resulting in a society where the wealthy indulged in luxury while the poor struggled to survive. William Beckford's observations of the time described a population of beggars marked by their strength of lungs, luxuriance of sores, profusion of vermin, variety and arrangement of tatters, and dauntless perseverance. Innumerable, blind, dumb, and scabby. These conditions reflected a nation that had allowed its ambition to erode. The treaties with England further entrenched Portugal's secondary status, relying on British naval power to protect their trade routes. John V, the monarch, lived a life of excessive indulgence, allocating considerable resources to the papacy. Frederick the Great observed, his pleasures were in priestly functions, his buildings were convents, his armies were monks, his mistresses were nuns. The church and its associated orders, such as the Jesuits, exerted considerable influence over Portuguese affairs, including land holdings and political power. This period was also marked by the activity of the Inquisition, which suppressed dissent, evidenced by the burning of 66 individuals, including a playwright on the very day his play was being performed. While the king was also a patron of the arts, financing projects such as the Montfort Convent and supporting the arts, it was not enough to improve the country's overall situation. Pombal and the Jesuits. The rise of Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marques de Pombal, shifted the political landscape of Portugal. Described by some as having a hairy heart and coming from a cruel and vindictive family, he was distrusted by John V as someone capable of defying a king. He assumed control of the government during a time of upheaval and immediately confronted the challenges that came with it. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 presented an immediate crisis. The event devastated the city, leaving over 15,000 dead and much of Lisbon in ruins. In the face of this catastrophe, Pombal responded with decisiveness. His orders were, "Bury the dead and relieve the living." He took steps to rebuild the city and implement modernization efforts. He also began to examine the root causes of Portugal's stagnation. Pombal identified two primary obstacles: the significant influence of the church, particularly the Jesuit order, and the economic dominance of Britain. The Jesuits possessed extensive holdings, including colonial enterprises, such as their control of Paraguayan territories with its 100,000 forced laborers. Their resistance to his plans provided Pombal with the opportunity to target the order. The Jesuits' interference with his attempts to secure Paraguayan land through the forced removal of its inhabitants also caused significant strife. Gabriel Malagrida, a Jesuit, became a focal point of the resistance, his actions marked by erratic behavior. It was said he distinguished himself at school by biting his hands till the blood flowed. He was also said to have been credited with miraculous powers, which caused him to gain a large following. The opportunity arose following an attempt on the king's life. Pombal used this as the justification to target his political enemies, most significantly the Jesuits. Despite the absence of concrete evidence, he orchestrated the removal of the Jesuits from the country. He employed the government's resources to disseminate propaganda that depicted the Jesuits as corrupt, thus consolidating public opinion in his favor. Pombal recognized that the situation offered the monarchy an opportunity to strengthen itself as against the church. He believed that in order to gain power you need to take it, especially against those that stand to restrict it. The response to the alleged attack was severe. The old Marchioness of Tavora was beheaded after being forced to see the methods in which her husband and her sons were to die. Even an anti-Jesuit historian stated that there is no positive evidence to connect the Jesuits with the outrage. Pombal's actions, while achieving their intended result, were ultimately tyrannical and instilled an atmosphere of fear and control. Pombal the Reformer. Pombal's reforms aimed to establish a society free from the restraints of religious institutions and reliance on external forces. He reorganized the military, diminished the influence of the aristocracy, nationalized governmental functions, and worked to diminish ecclesiastical domination. However, it was also clear that his reforms were slow and difficult to enforce. The triumph of the past. The decline of Pombal's influence began when the king died and his daughter, who resented Pombal's policies, assumed power. The queen released all those whom Pombal had imprisoned, thus ending his political career. On his last day as minister, he ordered a small fishing village burnt down for resisting his military reforms, a sign of his descent into tyranny. The new government promptly removed Pombal from his post and his opponents sought retribution. Pombal, now broke and discredited, faced the consequences of his actions. His enemies returned and reclaimed their possessions and the authority they once had. He felt hunted and wrote, "There is not a hornet or a gnat in Portugal that does not fly to this remote spot and buzz in my ears." He spent his final years suffering from what appeared to be a severe infection and reportedly died after being persuaded to consume a broth made from the flesh of snakes. Chapter 11. Spain and the Enlightenment. Milieu. Spain in 1700 was a superpower champion suddenly staggered. The king, Charles II, passed away without an heir, and the throne fell to France's Bourbon dynasty, with Philip V at its head. This succession triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, in which Philip V fought to retain the empire. However, Europe, not in agreement, carved up Spain, depriving it of Gibraltar and other key territories. The colonies in South and Central America proved to be the empire's true financial engine. Wheat production in these colonies yielded substantially more per acre than in mainland Spain. Spain's shipping of raw materials, mercury, copper, zinc, dyes, rubber, sugar, coffee, tobacco, among others, to Europe generated returns in silver and gold. This made Spain a major importer, a condition that stemmed from a lack of focus on developing its domestic industry. The economy was largely controlled by powerful families and the clergy, holding high positions within society. Spain, in effect, sat on a wealth of raw materials without focusing on industrial improvement. Monopolies such as the Mesta, where a few families controlled vast herds of wool-bearing animals, further concentrated economic power. Such a system did not encourage social mobility or innovation. The population nearly doubled by the century's end, reaching just over 10 million people, yet most lacked land ownership. The church's income nearly matched that of the state, exacerbating the social stratification. This arrangement created a society where a small group of families within the establishment were beyond the reach of law, and others faced generational poverty with little chance of upward movement, hindering a competitive and thriving society. The consequence of this was extreme social stratification, with individuals not reaching their potential, while those in power often attained their positions through birthright rather than merit. This environment fostered a population that favored religious observances over seeking to improve their situation. Piety was prevalent, with the Inquisition stifling knowledge and progress. The absence of printing presses and poor education left a large portion of the populace illiterate. The Enlightenment entered Spain. The Enlightenment began to infiltrate Spain, though encountering resistance because of Spain's deeply traditional society. While Spanish elites brought in foreign merchants and new ideas, progress was hindered by Catholic conservatism. Intellectuals who were influenced by French literature and scholarship started to critique Spain's religious traditions. This sparked innovation in intellectual circles, as some, like the Duke of Alba, began to embrace Enlightenment ideals. However, many rejected these ideas as an affront to religion. This created a division in how Spain was to be governed, between those who embraced new ideas and those who held to tradition. While some people openly expressed Enlightenment ideals, they were met with censorship from the Inquisition. Charles III, 1759-88. Charles III, an intriguing figure of contradictions, was an enlightened despot who maintained traditional ideals. He initially felt threatened by the Jesuits, whom he accused of calling him a bastard. This is not widely believed to be true. He implemented religious reforms and understood the need for logic and reason, drawing on contemporary thinkers who valued reason over tradition. However, he also knew the importance of tradition and religion in maintaining power. He saw religion as a means of control, uniting the populace and preventing rebellion. He combated corruption by regulating necessities such as oil and bread. While Charles did not completely reform the Inquisition, its power gradually declined. Despite reforms, people still faced punishment for expressing Enlightenment views. Pablo Olavide, a supporter of the Enlightenment who worked for Charles, faced trial and confiscation of his possessions after being accused of possessing pornographic paintings and banning monasteries from working with him. Universities and schools were updated with current knowledge. Spain began to prioritize wealth creation over accumulation, introducing low-interest loans and subsidies. Taxes were abolished and production of wheat increased, along with the construction of canals for irrigation and transport. This led to industrial growth and a generally more prosperous nation. In foreign policy, Spain did not fare well in the American War of Independence, failing to regain Gibraltar but acquiring Florida. By his death, Charles had become a more powerful and progressive leader. Chapter 12, Vale, Italia. Farewell Tour. Goethe, the German Titan, descended from the Alps, finding the air so agreeable that even poverty appeared pleasant. He observed, the inhabitants are always out of doors, and, in their lightheartedness, think of nothing but to live. However, he also expressed distaste for the unsanitary conditions he encountered. Then, Ghazi, an older traditionalist, lamented the perceived moral laxity, decrying the transformation of people into monkeys, a whirligig of fashion, and attributing it to philosophy. Religion, that salutary curb on human passion, has become a laughingstock. He criticized the decline of public order, claiming that the absence of strict punishments had led to an increase in crime, and that liberty had caused women to pursue frivolous fashions. Venice's power was waning, its wealth having diminished. The city elected Manin, a rich but indecisive figure, as its last doge. Napoleon then arrived, and Venice was transferred to Austrian control. Parma became a miniature version of Versailles, where French was spoken and culture was prominent. Milan, in contrast, experienced a period of growth, with expanding businesses, tax reforms, and the construction of an opera house. Corsica, a land frequently conquered by various powers from Phoenicians to Genoese, was eventually purchased by France. Paoli, a proto-Garibaldi figure, fought for the island's independence but was exiled. His aide, however, had a son, Napoleone Bonaparte, who would later reshape the era. Paoli was recalled, only to be deposed again by his former aide, demonstrating the shifting dynamics of power. Tuscany, under Leopold, underwent significant reforms, abolishing torture and capital punishment, but his increased paranoia led to a surveillance state. Rome, the great capital of the world, provided a sensation. A new life begins when a man once sees with his own eyes all that previously he has but partially heard or read of. The city, a diverse mix of beggars and tourists, was chaotic, with the lack of law and order, some claiming that at nighttime it is as the devil let loose, so people sought refuge in churches. It was also in Rome that new classical styles began to emerge. Naples, seemingly a place devoted to leisure, was described as such. You forget yourself in the world, and to me it is a strange feeling to go about with people who think of nothing but enjoying themselves. King Ferdinand was a child when the area went anti-clerical, which strengthened the monarchy. In Sicily, the landed lords continued their dominance of the land with injustice. The people preferred their saints, it appeared. The law and Beccaria. As Mozart put it, Italy was a place of both laziness and violence. A man, Schwendemann, was stabbed to death, with the perpetrator usually making for the nearest church. Once there, he is quite safe. Criminals found sanctuary within the church, while others were punished harshly. Adventurers. Cagliostro, originally Giuseppe Balsamo, began his life as a thief and forger. He became a con artist and pimp. His scams were never punished. He took on the title of Marchese, traveled across Europe, and sold his mistress in drugs that claimed to remove wrinkles. He was arrested for stealing diamonds, joined the Masons, and sold a rejuvenation course. His lies were discovered, and he was eventually arrested with his wife for his actions. Casanova, a self-proclaimed man of the ladies, was born of actors. He claimed to have a doctorate by the age of 16. He lived in poverty and played his fiddle to get by. He was supported by a benefactor and joined the Masons. He went to France and started his own secret scheme to get cash. He was also well known for having mistresses at most places he stopped. Casanova told Voltaire that he could not replace the ferocious monster that devours humanity because it is necessary. He returned to Venice and was put into the spy department, where he was then sacked for not being very good at his job. Chapter 13. The Enlightenment in Austria. The Austrian Empire was not a singular, unified entity, but a patchwork of territories: Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, among others, each with distinct cultures and languages, often harboring internal tensions. It was akin to managing an enterprise where discord prevails, yet unity of purpose is paramount, demanding a firm hand and unwavering control. Hungary remained a largely feudal society, where powerful nobles enjoyed vast privileges while the peasantry struggled under the burden of poverty. They accepted Habsburg rule so long as their own local power remained untouched, their privileges secured, and taxation avoided. The Austrian rulers granted them titles, offices, and honors, effectively securing their loyalty while maintaining centralized control. This did, however, lead to opulent displays of wealth, such as the extravagant palaces built by the nobility. Prince Esterhazy's residence included 126 guest rooms, and the very place where Haydn conducted. Bohemia, following the devastation of the 30 Years' War, was forced into Catholicism. Its lands shifted between Austrian and Prussian control, becoming a contested territory throughout the era. The Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, was another source of contention, with its nobles clinging fiercely to their ancient privileges rather than seeking progress through reason and logic. Figures like Prince Charles Joseph de Ligne, though known for his refined taste and prolific writings, ultimately held little influence in the power dynamics of the Austrian Empire. Maria Theresa, the pragmatic ruler. Maria Theresa was a figure of considerable substance. Unlike many of her royal counterparts, she was a leader of great practical ability. Frederick the Great himself acknowledged this when he said, "Except the Queen of Hungary and the King of Sardinia, whose genius triumphed over a bad education, all the princes of Europe are only illustrious imbeciles." She was not a product of the Enlightenment, but rather a devout woman who deftly combined piety with political acumen. She understood the importance of strategic diplomacy, rewarding loyalty while firmly dealing with those who challenged her authority. She recognized the necessity for the nobility and clergy to bear their share of taxation, thus limiting the church's power and wealth. She implemented significant reforms, with Ludwig Haugwitz modernizing the internal administration and Rudolf Chotek reorganizing the economy. Through their efforts, she transformed her realm into a more unified and robust state than the one she inherited. Joseph II, the idealistic reformer. Her son, Joseph, though intelligent, lacked the pragmatism of his mother. He was educated amidst the ideas of the Enlightenment, but failed to understand that ideas alone are insufficient without the capacity for effective execution. His education, described as if he were merely amusing himself, ill-prepared him for the harsh realities of leadership. He became known for his charm and was weakened by the death of his first wife, Isabella of Parma. He was deeply affected by her death, showcasing a dependency on emotional comforts, a weakness he never overcame. Joseph struggled with the traditional ceremonies and customs of the court. He was, at times, dismissive of what he perceived as empty rituals. He also found little comfort in his second marriage to Josepha of Bavaria, whom he viewed with distaste. His obsession with his first wife revealed a character more concerned with personal comfort than with effective rule. When he finally had some influence, he advocated for religious tolerance, the curtailment of church power, the liberation of the peasantry, and greater freedom of commerce and ideas. These were noble goals, yet his lack of ruthlessness meant they remained largely unfulfilled. His meeting with Frederick the Great further highlighted his deficiencies. Frederick's assessment of him: he is desirous of learning, but he has had no patience to instruct himself. His exalted position makes him superficial, boundless ambition devours him. He was aware of the internal problems of his empire, but lacked any strategy to execute a successful reform. His mother attempted to caution him, emphasizing that the free exercise of religion, which no Catholic prince can permit without heavy responsibility, and the destruction of the nobility were actions that would undermine his rule. She understood that his idealistic goals required a strong grasp of power, and Joseph did not yet possess it. Maria Theresa understood the realpolitik of her time. Joseph's actions were in contrast to this, highlighting a deficiency that crippled him throughout his life. The enlightened despot, reform, and resistance. Upon his mother's death, Joseph sought to implement his enlightened ideas with a sweeping series of reforms. He declared that he had made philosophy the lawgiver of my empire. He aimed to be an absolute monarch, but his execution was severely flawed. He promoted capitalist industry while simultaneously opposing the proliferation of machines for fear of job losses. He sought to create an army comparable to Prussia's, while initiating laws to free his peasants and establish a new legal code based on his philosophical ideals. Magic, witchcraft, and apostasy were no longer to be punishable by law. In line with his ideas, serfdom was abolished, with peasants gaining the right to move, own property, and marry of their own volition. He attempted to impose his vision without considering the resentment that his actions would stir up. He removed the influence of the old church, allowing the establishment of Protestant and Greek Orthodox churches. The people began to look at his weakness and began to revolt even when he attempted to give in to their demands. He was forced to restore the old administration, having failed to establish any new order that had wide support. He only kept the abolition of serfdom. Joseph's legacy. Joseph's death was a welcome relief to many within his empire. His reforms, while grounded in enlightened ideals, were implemented so poorly and with such a lack of understanding of the people that they were ineffective. As his epitaph stated, "Here lies Joseph, who could succeed in nothing." He died at the young age of 48. The country slowly recovered. Chapter 14. Music Reformed. A significant development at this time was the fusion of German and Italian musical traditions. But the story takes a dramatic turn with the arrival of Christoph Willibald Gluck, a figure who would revolutionize opera as it was known. Christoph Willibald Gluck, the reformer. Born a commoner in the Upper Palatinate, Gluck began his musical journey at a Jesuit school where he received a rigorous education in both academics and music. An opportunity arose in Milan under the patronage of Prince Melzi. After many movements, he made his opera debut in London. However, his efforts were not met with universal acclaim. The composer Handel was dismissive, remarking that Gluck knew no more counterpoint than his cook. Gluck, despite these dismissals, would continue to push forward. He was described as being horribly scarred by smallpox, and he had an ugly scowl. Gluck's journey took him from London to Paris, where he observed the works of Rameau. He conducted operas at Hamburg, had a liaison with an Italian singer, and contracted syphilis. Even in his struggles, he still went to Copenhagen, where he was unable to conduct due to his illness, showing an immense amount of grit to push forward. Upon his return to Vienna, he married Marianne Pergia, daughter of a rich merchant. Her dowry made him financially secure. This marriage secured his financial standing, allowing him the freedom to focus on his artistic pursuits. Gluck pressed onward with his groundbreaking operas. He even published a preface, written by Calzabigi, which declared the principles of his operatic reform. Gluck strived to make the music serve the drama, rather than simply showcasing arias. He himself said, "Trying to forget that I am a musician," emphasizing his dedication to a unified art form. The impact of his music was monumental, and it continues to be analyzed today. He pushed himself consistently, refining his music. Joseph Haydn, the friendly competitor. Haydn was a different character, a man who quarreled with no one but his wife, hailed his competitors as his friends, suffused his music with gaiety, and was constitutionally incapable of tragedy. He was born from no advantages in Rohrau, his parents being wagon maker and a house painter. At a young age, at the age of 6, he was sent to live with a relative, and his training was brutal. As an old man, he mentioned that he used to get more floggings than food. Even despite harsh treatment, he continued to grow. Haydn went to St. Stephen's Cantoria, which did not improve his quality of life. He was so poorly fed that he welcomed calls to sing in private homes, where he could fill his stomach besides singing his songs. He focused on his goals while still not forgetting the basic needs in life. He was almost castrated when his voice began to break, but his parents refused consent. When his voice began to break, he was free and penniless. Despite not being skilled in any instrument, he worked 16 hours, sometimes more. He took students, played violin and organ in order to build his career. This hard work led him to a steady position as a music director for Count Maximilian. His position allowed him artistic freedom. While at work, he produced nothing memorable till he was 32, but his later work would be transformative. Due to the quality of his work, he received gifts, fame, and a wide audience. Even in his old age, he was productive. He said, "My wife, that infernal beast, wrote me so many things that I was forced to answer that I was never coming back." Despite his struggles in his love life, he worked hard and composed 6 of his 12 London symphonies. Even in his later years, Haydn's music had the power to move people. Haydn's impact was the development of musical forms. His music reflected a stable feudal world and an environment of aristocratic security and ease. They were too gay and self-content to satisfy a century of revolutions, crises, and romantic ecstasies and despair. He adapted to his environment and was aware of his place in time. "I know that God has bestowed a talent upon me," Haydn said, "and I thank him for it. I think I have done my duty and been of use. Let others do the same." Chapter 15. Mozart, the Wonderful Boy, 1756 to 1766. Salzburg, a musical outpost of Vienna, was where it all began for young Wolfgang. The town, seemingly built on the foundation of sound, was ruled by an archbishop and was quite Catholic. His father, Leopold, an ambitious violinist, understood that his son Wolfgang was special. He refrained at some cost from taking other pupils, wishing to give full attention to his children. He wasn't merely caring, he was making a crucial investment. Wolfgang, at 3, began to pick out chords on the clavier. He could play full pieces from memory at 4 and invent compositions at 5. His father did not send him to school, rather teaching him everything, and Wolfgang would happily play the keyboard all day unless someone stopped him. Years later, Leopold wrote to his son that he were serious rather than childlike, and when you were at the clavier or otherwise engaged with music, you would not suffer the least joking to go on with you. In 1762, while war ravaged Germany, Leopold took his prodigies to Munich and Vienna, and there he had encounters with royalty, with Wolfgang hopping on the Empress's lap and proclaiming to the 7-year-old Archduchess, "You are good," he said, and gratefully added, "I will marry you." Then the boy was struck by scarlet fever, and so they went home in 1763. Leopold took his kids on the road in 1763 after getting promoted. There were performances at Mainz and at Frankfurt. Goethe himself was in the audience as the kids were essentially paraded as almost a circus wonder. In a Frankfurt newspaper announcement it promised, "The little girl, who is in her 12th year, will play the most difficult compositions of the greatest masters. The boy, who is not yet 7, will perform on the clavichord or harpsichord. He will also play a concerto for the violin and will accompany symphonies on the clavier, the keyboard being covered with a cloth, with as much facility as if he could see the keys. He will instantly name all notes played at a distance, whether singly or in chords, on the clavier or on any other instrument, bell, glass, or clock. He will finally, both on the harpsichord and the organ, improvise as long as may be desired, and in any key." The boy might have loved applause, just as the father loved florins. After disappointing encounters, they reached Brussels, and the prince finally deigned to see them, and so they finally ended up in Paris. There they met Grimm. At last. True miracles are rare, but how wonderful it is when we have the opportunity to see one, said Grimm, after which the most lordly homes opened to them. And again, "The child will turn my head if I listen to him much more." Adolescence, 1766 to 1777. Back in Salzburg, Leopold didn't let up as a taskmaster. He poured his teaching skills into his son. The archbishop demanded the boy was just copying the father, so they were separated, and it was revealed he really did have talent. The composer. Mozart started gaining confidence as he made a name for himself. His music took from Italy, and he would go on to write some of his best works. His catalog has over 600 works with multiple genres spanning over 36 years. It was hard work despite the perception of the critics that his moments of rest made him lazy and indolent. His father said procrastination was his best-selling sin. Despite all this, the pieces came with seemingly great timing and were amazing in how they appeared seemingly out of nothing. When doing composition, Mozart wouldn't try pieces out on instruments until finished, and he kept fragments in his pockets and in the side of his carriage. Musicians loved his improvisation. Mozart's memories allowed him to read as aggregates, his fingers doing it as phrases and just as quickly like a paragraph. Spirit and flesh. Mozart wasn't the most visually striking. In the day-to-day, he did everything he could to try and counteract that. His personality shifted after all the fame came upon him, but before he had a loving, trusting nature, all that had some side effects of fame that came with him. Requiem, 1791. 3 important commissions are the reason the next year would end the way it did for Mozart, as his friends started to see a change in the once so bright and amazing man. He was already starting to give up on his mortal life. Tell me that my time has struck, and before I can display all of my skills. Life was beautiful though. In his final months, he poured everything into the Requiem. I am writing this Requiem for myself. He completed half of it, and those fragments were rough, from an unsettled man that was collapsing. In November, swelling had caused him paralysis and pain. His friends tried their best. He was taken to St. Mark's Church, but only for his blessings. Because, as they were impoverished, there was no other way, he was just put in a mass pauper grave. No name or marker, only a pit for the lost, and that when the widow came to visit days later, no one could identify where his remains actually were. Chapter 16, Islam. All right, let us cut through the noise and examine the Islamic world in the 18th century. This is not a mere anecdote, but a study of how power, tradition, and decision-making intertwined, often with perplexing results. The Turks. The Ottoman Empire, a vast entity stretching from the Balkans to North Africa, held immense territory. They controlled vital trade routes and blocked Russia's access to the Mediterranean. Despite their strategic dominance, the empire displayed signs of stagnation, with very little technological progress being made throughout the lands. The population, for the most part, remained content, adhering rigidly to tradition over embracing change. While a respect for history is essential, clinging to it at the expense of progress proved to be a perilous course. As Lady Mary Wortley Montagu observed, "The learned have no more faith in the inspiration of Muhammad than in the infallibility of the Pope. They make a frank profession of deism among themselves, or to those they can trust, and never speak of the Quran but as a political institution." The religious landscape also displayed fractures. The split between Sunni and Shia continued to be a source of conflict, and now with the appearance of the Wahhabites, the Puritans of Islam, challenging the established order by calling for an individualistic interpretation of religious texts. Education fell under the clergy's control, where obedience, not intellect, was prioritized. Important pursuits withered as they preferred astrology over astronomy, alchemy over chemistry. While their art, especially pottery, textiles, and rugs, remained noteworthy, this period represented an artistic decline. The question loomed: what was the point of great past achievements if present contributions failed to meet or surpass them? The Ottomans' perceived superiority over Europeans was also apparent in their cleanliness practices. The public baths that they prided themselves on and even their love of flowers made clear that they did not feel the need to adjust what they considered their intended purpose. This ultimately proved to be a strategic misstep that they would eventually pay dearly for. There were also clear signs of decay throughout the empire, evident through the decline in trade, rampant corruption, and frequent Janissary rebellions. Sultans who chose the pleasure of their harems over statecraft and military concerns added to the weakening of the empire. When territorial losses mounted and raids on Persia ended badly, resulting in the vizier Ibrahim Pasha's death, as well as Ahmed's abdication, these demonstrated an empire in constant flux and unable to maintain control. The consequence of those missteps would soon become a tragic event. Bulgaria declared independence, and the subsequent war with Russia ended in disaster. The emperor died of grief. African Islam. Egypt presents a similar tale of conquest and shifting loyalties. The region came under the control of Turkish pashas and local Mamelukes. Much like other stories of those trained for subservience gaining power, these individuals gradually became a force challenging those they had sworn allegiance to. This power move often had an underlying element that after a charismatic leader passes, the structure eventually crumbled with fighting from within, such as the story of Ali Bey, who rose from being sold as a child to declaring Egypt independent only to be betrayed. Trade continued, with only a small portion of people profiting, with much wealth being squandered on lavish indulgences. Skilled artisan trades flourished, but this prosperity could also allow an industry to fall under the monopolistic control of only a select few, making it hard to enter for new entrants. Religion maintained absolute control. Will Durant writes, Islamic theology, like the Christian, considered women a main source of evil, which could be controlled only by her strict subordination, thus shaping societal norms and constraining women to the point of their marriages being orchestrated from a very young age, while they were still expected to carry themselves with dignity and grace. Music served the purposes of love and war. Women were delegated seductive dances and not involved in anything more. The Barbary states, or lands of the allegedly barbarous Berbers, Tripoli, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, entered history in the 18th century chiefly through the exploits of their corsairs or the assassination of their rulers, becoming pirates who took captives in order to gain ransoms. Ironically, their leadership was often composed of Christians. A Moroccan man's observation after returning from Europe was particularly telling. What a comfort to be getting back to civilization. Persia, in the words of Will Durant, the 18th was a bitter century for Persia, conquered by Afghans from the southeast, harassed by slave-gathering raids from the Uzbeks in the northeast, attacked by Russian depredations in the north, repeatedly overrun by vast Turkish armies in the west, impoverished by the tax-gathering tyranny of its own spectacular Nader Shah. They might have admitted the superiority of Christendom in science, commerce, and war, but would have preferred art to science and handicrafts to mechanized industry. The preference for old ideals would always put them at a disadvantage. Continuous conflict and civil unrest was a normal state for the region. The Afghans started by overthrowing existing leaders. The Afghan leader Mahmud put to death in hot blood 3,000 of Hussein's bodyguard, 300 Persian nobles, and some 200 children suspected of resenting the murder of their fathers. Nader Kuli, slave of the wonderful, arose from this chaos, initially sold into servitude before rising as a robber to eventually conquer entire cities. Nader's ambitions led to new conquests and reclaiming lost territory from the Turks after his forces beat them on the field of battle. His military campaign was a march that dwarfed the famous crossings of Germany by Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. Nader's ambitions expanded to India. The wealth gained by the conquest of India, including the Peacock Throne, which had been made for Shah Jahan at the zenith of Mughal power. Chapter 17, Russian Interlude. Work and Rule. Will Durant writes, "Of all the neighbors of Prussia, Russia merits most attention as being the most dangerous. It was powerful and near. The landmass expanded from 687,000 to 913,000 square kilometers, and its population surged from 13 to 36 million. However, this growth did not reflect an economic revolution. The vast majority of the population, 97.7% in 1722 and 96.4% in 1790, were peasants tied to the soil, and over half were serfs. This system of servitude meant that one human could own another. The social structure was a hierarchical system. Approximately 100,000 nobles owned half the land, the church owned some, and the remainder belonged to the crown. Serfs were considered a form of currency. The more serfs one possessed, the wealthier one was considered. Count Peter Cheremitiev controlled a staggering 140,000 serfs, more than the citizen count of many countries. Landlords wielded absolute power over their serfs. They could sell them, punish them, or exile them. The serfs, despite facing harsh conditions, displayed both resilience and compassion. Adding to this exploitation were those free men who accumulated wealth and became new oppressors, lending money at exorbitant rates. While serfs could sometimes buy their freedom or join the army, it was always under the authority of their owners. Military service did offer some, though perhaps slim, opportunities. The burgeoning of early capitalism was more about survival than the accumulation of personal wealth. By 1748, inventors like Pulsanov integrated steam engines into ironworks. At the center of this activity, Moscow emerged as the largest city in Europe. However, in contrast to Moscow, St. Petersburg served as the seat of government where French ideas were ascendant. These two centers acted as rival focal points that Russian civilization revolved around, resulting in conflict and a fragmented nation. Corruption permeated society. If there be a Russian proof against flattery, there is not one who can resist the temptation of gold. Religion and culture. Religion also significantly influenced this era. People were reportedly susceptible to omens and devoted themselves before images of their faith. The church held immense wealth, its bells often outweighing oxen. Religion, though prominent, struggled to regulate the behaviors of the populace. Beauty and horror coexisted in a complex juxtaposition, marked by rude language and violence. Activities like gambling, drinking, and theft seemed common. Fashion ranged from Parisian trends to the practical sheepskins and mittens of the peasantry. During the summer months, people would bathe uninhibitedly in streams where the segregation of genders was disregarded. Musical culture thrived, with choirs incorporating Russian and Italian influences. Two prominent figures were Sazonowicz Berezovsky, who studied under Padre Martini in Italy, and Mirty Bortniansky, who led the court church choir. Their musical education was rigorous and comprehensive, with the utilization of boys' soprano voices alongside deep bass tones. Russian politics, 1725-41. Following the death of Peter the Great, Russian politics became chaotic. Peter's widow, Catherine I, usurped power with the aid of palace guards and proclaimed herself empress. She was reportedly fond of drink, leaving governance to her former lover and the Supreme Council, which met until the early hours of the morning. She died a few years later, having named the same boy her successor that she usurped the throne from. Peter II died as well, which brought forth another empress from the daughter of Peter the Great's brother, Anna Ivanovna, who accepted conditions for taking the throne. However, Anna later dismissed these limitations on the authority of the army, further emboldened by the backing of military forces. Anna's preference for Germans in positions of power and the influence of her lover Ernst von Buren led to the removal of opponents. Conflicts with Turkey occurred in search of dominance over the Black Sea and the Crimean territories. Though early victories occurred, those gains were ultimately reversed during the signing of the treaty with the Turks. Elizaveta Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, leveraged the support of the nobility, turning up at 2 a.m. in military uniform and seizing power through an assertive use of strength. Russia celebrated the enthronement of a full Russian empress, Elizabeth Petrovna, 1741-62. Elizabeth was described as beautiful, majestic, and sturdy, despite her stature, without disfigurement. Though uninterested in marriage, she was seen as preferring various gay lengths while also appearing outwardly religious. While some spoke of heavy drinking, others pointed to Russian custom and the harsh conditions as justification. Elizabeth's approach involved administering both severe punishment and kindness. Her court was embroiled in revelries and scandals, but civil progress was also made. Elizabeth, while improving the economy and removing tariffs, did take a darker stance by banning and exiling 35,000 Jews. Her troops inflicted severe losses on Frederick II when Elizabeth's own health began to deteriorate and bring her reign to a close. The looming question of an heir had to be dealt with, thus her selection of Karl Friedrich Ulrich as her heir, who would become known as Peter III, an unsuitable selection. However, his wife was not. Peter and Catherine, 1743-61. Peter, born in 1728, had both Russian and Swedish claims. Frail in health, his formal education began at age 7, training him for military life. By the age of 9, he had been made a sergeant of the Holstein Guards. The addition of a strict Lutheran tutor would destroy any proper upbringing and replace it with fear, obstinance, and cruelty. He was damaged by a lack of proper leadership and parenting in his formative years. Appointed Grand Duke in 1743, his penchant for drunkenness grew to an unhealthy rate. Peter's choice of a partner, however, gave hope for a potentially viable ruler. Sophia Augusta Frederica, a cousin of the same name as two other members of the royal family, displayed potential with her ambitious character. Though her parents seemed uninterested in the fate of their girl child, Sophia showed a spark from the beginning. Though initially facing problems in posture and spine, she seemed to correct them. Intelligence was more important to her now, as she found her looks could only offer so much. Sophia began demonstrating intellectual curiosity through the challenge and the amount of questions she posed to her instructors. Following an invitation to Russia to be paired with Peter, the first trip was reportedly brutal. Though the initial meeting with Peter appeared adequate until he claimed himself a loyal Lutheran. She remained focused, disregarding all other interests but the Russian crown. Fully dedicated to integration, she became Catherine on the 28th of June. The following day saw her betrothal to Grand Duke Peter. They married after 14 months of planning. Her intellect, juxtaposed to Peter's limitations, proved a point of constant conflict. Her love diminished as well due to a smallpox attack on him during the engagement. Peter continued to display alcoholism and Catherine grew disdainful of the situation. Catherine focused her time on reading literature and philosophical texts. The marriage had not been consummated despite how far along it was. It was mentioned there were clearly psychological problems in Peter's capacity to do so. She began seeing the marriage more as one of convenience. Peter engaged with different mistresses and together they began their work of undermining each other in their destructive relationship. Her lady-in-waiting gave reasons that excused infidelity on Catherine's behalf, an idea widely believed to have originated with the Empress herself. Catherine subsequently entered a love affair with an officer named Saltykov during her pregnancies and 2 miscarriages as well as the successful birth of 1 son. Peter, on the other hand, began falling deeper into drink and further sexual engagements with other mistresses as well as members of the Chancellor's family. Stories existed surrounding Catherine and Stanislaus Poniatowski and the nature of their affair, which occurred until her last days. Catherine, by this point, also had a secret child with Grigory Orlov, who by many was considered to be an attractive brute, and this was the match to set an explosive situation into motion. With Elizabeth's failing health, the schemes behind the scenes developed at a rapid pace. Catherine, receiving threats of removal, acted. Elizabeth died on January 5th, marking Peter's accession to the throne. The stage had been set for the climatic change to come. Peter III, 1762. With Peter now emperor, he moved forward by paying off Catherine's debts while also taking up housing with his mistress at the palace. This created tension at the palace, seemingly acting as some attempt to find some peace, but in reality causing more rifts. Though a man who gave to loyal allies who had suffered previously, freeing them from their punishments, even absolving nobles of the mandatory state service, Peter's subsequent actions negated most of this good faith, with a shift toward nationalizing church land. The most contentious point that undid him was the choice to end the war with Prussia and align with them while dropping Austria as an ally. The military sought his removal, and by wanting to reform Russia by way of Prussia, the Russian army had completely withdrawn any respect for him, ultimately showing the end of his authority. When Russia was planning the attack on Denmark, the Russian military declared its refusal to participate, and Peter's reign truly had no more support left to fall back upon. Catherine stormed the Winter Palace with the military and made the announcement that she was to now be the Empress of Russia. Suited in the captain's attire, she declared her reign to all. Chapter 18. Catherine the Great. The Autocrat. Catherine did not simply inherit power, she seized it with decisive action. Following the coup that deposed Peter III, her soldiers were rewarded, and in the ensuing chaos, Catherine was informed. "Our men are terribly drunk." A hussar shouted to them, "To arms! 30,000 Prussians are coming to take away our mother!" So they armed themselves and are coming to see how you really are. The death of Peter followed with rumors of his poisoning or strangulation. Durant notes that the details of the murder were never fully revealed, and the part played in it by Catherine remains uncertain. In a world shocked by the event, Frederick the Great conceded that the Empress was quite ignorant of this crime, and she heard of it with a despair which was not feigned, for she justly foresaw the judgment that everybody passes upon her today. The lover. Catherine did not seek romance, rather she used relationships for their political value, creating a system where lovers effectively served as her ministers, providing them both prestige and profit in exchange for loyalty. As Durant states, nor perhaps was there any post in which the Empress displayed more choice and discernment. I believe no instance occurred of its having been filled by a person incapable of it. She didn't tolerate incompetence, viewing these relationships as tools in service of her grand strategy. There was no space for naivete in her affairs, with even her choice of lovers seen as an investment. She considered this a matter of her serving the empire and educating competent youths. Lavish rewards, exemplified by the Orloffs' receipt of 17 million, Potemkin's 50 million, and Lanskoy's 7 million, demonstrate how much wealth she was willing to invest in those loyal to her objectives. The rotation of her 21 lovers throughout her 4-decade rule is not reflective of a capricious nature, but rather a calculation where failed performances led to removal from position. Her lack of resentment or vengeance allowed her to move with detachment through her reign. The Philosopher. Catherine engaged with leading intellectual figures such as Voltaire, Diderot, and D'Alembert for a specific purpose. These weren't just intellectual acquaintanceships, but alliances designed to add another dimension to her public standing. Catherine's use of the philosophical endorsement displayed a shrewd and astute strategy to boost her credibility. Even Diderot was challenged by her sharp mind. "Monsieur Diderot, I have listened with the greatest pleasure to all that your brilliant intellect has inspired. With all your high principles one would make fine books, but very bad business." The Statesman. Catherine faced a state described as chaotic and disorganized, which forced her into mastering statecraft with an intensity born of survival. She had studied mankind, she reasoned, learning to use men without surrendering to them unreservedly. It was this mastery that enabled her to enact legal reforms. Aiming to play Justinian to Russia, she sought the wisdom of her council to ensure Russia must be thought of as a European state and should have a constitution based upon European principles. However, even as she attempted reforms, she was weary that any sudden change from existing custom would plunge Russia into disorder, recognizing the risks that her actions would entail to her own status. She used this awareness to get to know her people more by delving deep into the core values that underpinned their state. Rather than a utopian ideal of equality, Catherine sought practical efficiency in the construction of social hierarchies which further solidified her dominion. The abolition of torture and the establishment of religious toleration were not born out of pure philanthropy, but rather as effective instruments for power, which brought her into the popular view. By making the Russian church subservient, and thereby having the state become the payer of salaries to the clergy as written in Durant's account. The salaries of the Orthodox clergy were henceforth paid by the state, so ensuring their support of the government. Catherine secured support while simultaneously reinforcing the power of the central system of state. The creation of educational institutions like colleges for teachers, whilst ambitious, fell short when faced with social customs, as she acknowledged that parents would prefer children for work rather than education. And yet there was still expansion, including the establishment of hospitals, foundling, and insane asylums, indicating her awareness of public good. The Economist. Catherine knew her approach must be pragmatic, so instead of adhering to theoretical constructs, she commissioned studies on how the economy of Russia rested upon the organization of agriculture by a feudal system of lords and serfs. She dismissed idealistic calls for the abolishment of serfdom after listening to land nobility who saw this as an impossibility to alter. Durant noted that the proportion of serfs in the rural population rose from 52.4% at the outset of the reign to 55.5% at its close, an acceptance of the status quo when her power was at stake. Pugachev's Cossack revolt served to prove the ever-present volatility within this system. His efforts attracted over 20,000 men, all driven by their dissatisfaction in society. Catherine remained unfazed, and this rebellion ended with the capture of Pugachev as an act that ultimately reasserted her authority. Her backing of middle classes in a free market with increased industrial and commercial activity expanded the volume of foreign commerce from 21 million rubles in 1762 to 96 million by 1796. The warrior. Initial inclinations toward peace were supplanted with the thirst for geopolitical expansion and influence. Catherine held aspirations to be joined in bonds of friendship with all the powers, an armed alliance, and hence become the arbiter of Europe. Religious pretext was used by Catholics to rally against the Russians by trying to engage Turkey in conflict with the intention to destroy the Russian sphere of influence, but all Catherine saw was a greater opportunity, with Voltaire noting, If they wage war on you, perhaps Peter the Great's idea of making Constantinople the capital of the Russian Empire may take shape. It was in the great battles between Russia and Turkey that Catherine's authority gained momentum. 17,000 Russians defeated 150,000 Turks at Kagel, and her fleet crushed the opposition's navy, which served as a symbol of what she had accomplished in her path to regional domination and the Black Sea. However, for Catherine it was still insufficient. The ambition continued. She also strategized for the capture of Crimea, and after a trip to the region, Potemkin managed to fold it into her sphere of influence with the collapse of any coherent defense. She played for greater and larger domains. In another conflict with Turkey, the Russians managed to overcome insurmountable odds after 10,000 fatalities, which finally caused Durant to concede that she had risen to the zenith of her career as the most powerful ruler in Europe. Journey's end. Her rule experienced change when, during the French Revolution, she began to worry that her control might finally weaken, pushing her against the philosophy of liberty and intellectual discussion that was integral to the formation of her public persona. This calculated shift served the goal of further extending her reign by using it to keep the Western powers busy while she completed her absorption of Poland. She clarified her motives best herself with, "Many of my enterprises are unfinished. The courts of Berlin and Vienna must be occupied so as to leave us unfettered." Her final moments were uneventful as she seemed as gay as ever. She had a quick and uncontested death at the height of her capabilities. According to Will Durant, her greatest achievement lay in carrying on the efforts of Peter the Great to bring Russia into Western civilization. She is the only woman ruler who has surpassed England's Elizabeth in ability and equaled her in the enduring significance of her work. Chapter 19, The Rape of Poland. Polish Panorama, 1715 to 1764. The Polish geopolitical situation was difficult from its inception. Its geography presented a distinct disadvantage, a vast flat expanse with no significant mountain ranges or wide rivers to provide natural defenses. This vulnerability rendered the country akin to an open field, exposed to aggressors. While possessing a territory as expansive as France, its access to the sea was limited to the port of Danzig, a point of entry rendered indefensible. National unity proved elusive, with constant friction between Poles, Germans, Jews, Lithuanians, and Russians. Religious unity was equally absent. The dominant Catholic majority exerted its influence over the dissidents, comprising Protestants, Greek Orthodox adherents, and Jews. This internal discord, marked by constant strife, hindered the development of a cohesive national identity. Even political unity remained absent, as power resided in the Sejm, or Diet, where the infamous liberum veto granted each noble the power to unilaterally annul any legislative session or law. This procedural mechanism effectively allowed any single individual to dismantle any concerted effort. The monarchy was rendered subservient to the whims of the Sejm. Beneath the gentry, the serfs toiled the land, subjected to a system of near slavery. Bound to the land and their masters, they were compelled to surrender a portion of their earnings and dedicate several days per week to unpaid labor. They were poorer, humbler, and more miserable than anyone else witnessed during the time. The industrial sector also remained undeveloped because the landowning class feared a strong middle class. Towns and cities suffered severe neglect, with many being described by Antoni Potocki as dens of robbers that their populations fled from, thus adding to their overall state of disrepair. Even cultural hubs declined as people departed, with educational institutions suffering as a consequence. Adding fuel to this inferno of mismanagement were the internal religious conflicts, which destroyed all potential for any civic progress. These conflicts, exemplified by riots in Turin due to disrespect from some students towards the Catholic customs, that led to 9 of the protesters being executed. This event, in turn, prompted intervention from external powers. The nobles indulged in self-serving excesses and pleasures, while the serfs were more moral as it was their necessity to be. For those of a higher class, such as Pan Komarczewski, who would drain a bucket of champagne with ease, the standard was indulgence and lack of direction, wasting the potential to do good with their elevated station. While gentry dressed like peacocks and showed off in their garments, their kingdom was crumbling in front of them. The First Partition, 1768 to 1772. In the absence of effective leadership, the state of Poland deteriorated further, becoming a puppet to the Russian government and causing an uproar in national factions which quickly degraded into a civil war, resulting in massive bloodshed. Frederick the Great of Prussia, recognizing Poland's state of collapse as an opportunity, proclaimed the necessity for its division to achieve stability and peace amongst neighboring powers. Despite desperate attempts to create a new constitution that were proposed by Mobley and Rousseau, and even an absurd declaration to their divine intervention, the inevitable end came. Poland continued its spiral into disarray. The situation looked like that of a dying animal, with the surrounding nations hungry for their pieces of land. As Catherine II even made clear that Poland's demise was something everyone wanted for their benefit. They took the liberty to simply divide the land among each other, with Russia, Prussia, and Austria acting in total unison without challenge or question by their fellow European counterparts, as Poland's slow descent was considered as a deserved outcome for its outdated ways. What resulted was the victory of a more disciplined, organized nation over one that is disorganized and divided. All of Poland's shortcomings came from their unwillingness to find a common goal, instead focusing on small selfish pursuits that kept them weak. The Polish Enlightenment, 1773 to 1791. Despite the recent loss of land, an era of reform followed, all under the watchful eye of Russia that was set to prevent any move to damage its interests. Under this environment, the nation began to build internal strength. This involved deepening rivers, connecting the Baltic and Black Seas, establishing national schools, and nurturing cultural growth by investing in writers, artists, and overall cultural innovation. Poland finally learned of the mistakes it made and finally chose to be self-aware, as writers like Naruszewicz or Krasicki helped raise awareness with poems and satire on religious feuds, calling the nation for action. They learned that if the proper environment is created, there's potential within even the most troubled individuals to do well. They started forming alliances, a symbol of hope that finally allowed them to regain strength and power, especially because Frederick II, now on his last stretch, promised them military protection, finally giving them a real opportunity to completely take away the threat of foreign occupation. Russia at this moment was distracted with its own conflict, thus enabling Poland to grow into a power, and causing the king, Poniatowski, to seek to implement a brand new constitution to finally fix the main ailments of Polish society. His creation would completely reform the political landscape of the country by eradicating the liberum veto and switching it from majority vote, and it gave every religion the right to practice openly. The system was made foolproof when Poniatowski led a meeting that ratified the entire system to give it legal power. Dismemberment, 1792 to 1795. But as it would always be the case for Poland, it could never catch a break, as the Prussian alliance would create even further disputes with the rest of the nations. Especially Russia and Catherine were never going to let them go, so in the most ironic display of history, those who hated Poniatowski called Russian troops to once again intervene, causing everything that they gained, once again, lost. It seems Poland was destined to be under someone else's thumb, no matter their actions or best intentions. Now, once again, Poland had its plans foiled by the abandonment of the Prussian king due to issues with the revolution in France, causing another invasion. The nation fell apart, and many were in hiding. In but a few months, all the recent reformations of the nation were for nothing, as Poland once again lost land due to the new division created by Russia and Prussia. Poland did not understand the value of long-term strategy. Chapter 20, Frederick's Germany. Frederick victorious. This was not a fairy tale ending. He was a man who returned from the 7 Years' War looking more like a ghost than an ogre. He was sad and victorious after the brutal contest, entering Berlin to a destitute populace. The man had pushed himself to the absolute limit, his body, mind, and will depleted. Frederick lived in his palace as if he was in a camp. His approach to governance was severe, officials harassed with spies, pay curtailed, initiative stifled, and detailed commands enforced. Frederick did not prioritize love or being loved. He respected his neglected queen solely for her devotion to the state. This was not to say that he was completely without feeling. He wept all day when his dogs died, and he openly expressed his love for his mother and his sister, a marked deviation from the cold logic he generally employed. Frederick believed that the only way to avoid societal collapse is a minority that can convince the masses to let them lead. Aristocracy breeds honor and loyalty, while the bourgeoisie chase riches. The middle class do not value legacy as the elite do. He did not require public approval. He knew what was best for his nation. He stated it verbatim. "I have relied on my honest purpose and my good conscience, and on the information in my possession, and have calmly pursued my way." His actions became the core of what the philosophies desired, and even managed to inspire him with the view of kingship as a sacred service to his people. Despite his wars, he had become the idol of the French philosophies and softened the hostility of even Rousseau. Rebuilding Prussia. He labored harder than anyone, rising at 5, sometimes 4. He worked ceaselessly with no family ties, no court ceremonies, and no religious holidays. He instituted a Bureau of Accounts, directing that all government dealings be examined and that any suspicion of irregularity should be reported. He practically eliminated corruption in his nation. His household was managed with austerity. He wore old coats, waistcoats soiled with snuff as a simple soldier's wardrobe, nothing more. The justice system was codified to protect the individual from oppression, with limited forms of serfdom allowed. He provided benefits to the masses. He put every child in Prussia from their 5th to their 14th year into schools, although they were only allowed to learn a little reading and writing. He believed it was wise to not over-educate the poor. There must always be a social hierarchy. Using his funds, he spent 20 million thalers to fix Prussia, giving aid, seeds for sowing, and animals to all the areas most impacted. With easy loans to entrepreneurs, worker importation, and trade growth by removing internal tolls and road building, Berlin rapidly grew to become the center of the area. He taxed everything, even street singers, because revenue from its citizens is the only way a state functions. Prussia doubled in size, spread in education, and repressed intolerance. He built the foundations for a unified and powerful Germany, leading to the era of Bismarck. The Principalities. Germany at the time was not a nation, but a loose federation of nearly independent states lacking any true structure. They had common language, literature, and art, but they greatly differed in their manners, dress, coinage, and creed, ill-equipped to stand against larger powers in their current state. Frederick observed this and remarked, "Most small princes ruin themselves by reckless extravagance, misled by the illusion of their imagined greatness." The youngest son of an appanage dynasty imagines he is of the same stamp as Louis XIV. Class distinctions were emphasized among nobles, clergy, army officers, and merchants to keep people from crossing each other. The morals of court reflected French behaviors with drinking, gambling, adultery, and divorce. The German Enlightenment. The German university became the core of society, used to enforce educational standards. Professors were public officials, not serving a divine cause, though they were required to adhere to the religion of the leader. The faculties until 1789 enjoyed some degree of freedom of thought and academic autonomy. Karl von Zedlitz encouraged thought for itself rather than training to serve as teachers of medicine or law. In essence, Germany was promoting free thinking. Many were helped into getting a university degree, leading to no class distinctions among students. This translated to experimental and new forms of education. The Aufklärung saw that the German mind was influenced by both English and French free thinking combined, creating something truly unique. Der alte Fritz. Old Fritz was the nickname for Frederick, now an aging king of Prussia. Though he did not gain the love of his subjects, he received the ultimate respect and was known as the best Teuton for his work ethic. After all his achievements, he attempted to follow in the footsteps of Voltaire by becoming a historian, writing history, poetry, treatises, philosophy, and letters. This created a 30-volume collection. His greatest pieces were Histoire de mon temps, where he explored his rule, describing how much that was made by the follies of men and luck. He twice gave a testament on all that he had achieved, stating that Prussia must strive and acquire more land and use it wisely while always employing its military. He was preparing his successor and also urged them to avoid religion and let free thought flourish. Frederick doubted if his nephew had enough strength or heart for leadership. 2 years later, he stated that if he failed, there would be no Prussia. The state became his sole focus, and everything else was simply in its path. Even in his old age, Frederick did not allow anything to distract him from his work, not even his worsening gout and asthma. At 74, he sat in heavy rain on his horse for 6 hours that caused pneumonia and ended his career. He was interred near his father's grave. Interestingly, Napoleon said of the situation, "If he were here, we wouldn't be." Chapter 21. Kant. The Foundations. Immanuel Kant was very much a product of his time. His intellectual development was marked by a complex interplay of influences. Under Frederick the Great's more liberal approach to thought, Kant had room to breathe. However, with Frederick's death, the Prussian government moved to suppress ideas deemed dangerous, placing constraints upon Kant and his pursuits. Kant's philosophy was, therefore, a synthesis, part Enlightenment rationalist, part Romantic thinker. His pietist upbringing, intertwined with Wolff's rationalism, the ideas of the Philosophers, and the empiricism of Locke and Leibniz, along with Hume, formed a unique intellectual background. Kant's early life extended beyond philosophy. The strictures of imposed prayer sessions as a child, and the necessity of tutoring to support himself, ministry not being fulfilling enough, shaped him. He then became a private docent, a position that demanded he appealed to students to secure his pay. These experiences impacted his understanding of the world. Prior to his dedication to philosophy, Kant engaged in scientific inquiry. He measured forces, studied tides, explored the age of the Earth and Sun. He also posited the nebular hypothesis of solar system creation. Creation, he wrote, is never complete, it is always ongoing. Eventually, he committed to philosophy when he became a professor at the age of 46. His experience as a private docent, where he taught concepts concerning sensible and intelligible worlds, a common academic notion at the time, paved the way for his later theories. It was all, in a way, merely a prelude to his most profound work. Critique of Pure Reason 1781. Critique of Pure Reason is not a casual reading endeavor, and a challenge for many, deliberately so. Kant was meticulous. This work was the result of 12 years of contemplation that were reduced to 4 or 5 months of dedicated writing. In this work, he explores the limitations of reason independently from experience, engaging with such concepts as critique, empirical and transcendental understanding. His analysis of these concepts has challenged the very foundation of such terms, even to this day. His project was to reconcile all thought. Experience provides the foundation of understanding, but the mind fundamentally structures experience through the categories. He had certainly felt the effects of David Hume, who acknowledged the basis of experience to understand the cause, but all there is to observe are sequences based upon intellectual supposition. With such an acknowledgement, his understanding of causality as prior would allow for a richer, more robust system of thought. He posited that categories were inherent forms of thought. Our minds do not passively observe, but rather actively interpret sensory input. He asserted that time and space are not objective realities, but modes in which our minds organize experience. As for the existence of objects beyond sensory perception, the noumenal world, the thing in itself remains unknowable. While the mind acts as an agent that actively shapes sensations into concepts, our understanding is limited to the phenomenal world, what appears to us through our senses. Kant attempted to provide a rational structure for spirituality by discussing pure or theoretical reason to address free will, the soul, and God. Through such things as paralogisms and antinomies, he argued against concrete answers regarding questions surrounding belief or disbelief. His method served as a guide in the pursuit of understanding and in gaining some degree of intellectual peace. His theories prompted the belief of a world which arose from a high intelligence, and thus we have to think as though God exists. This approach, he argues, was crucial for morality, influencing behavior. With the understanding of the soul as immortal and the will being free, it would further serve as a practical element for human functioning in a day-to-day manner. This concept received mixed reviews. Skeptics labeled Kant as an agnostic, while theologians expressed displeasure that Kant would put so many obstacles in the way of faith. In response, Kant wrote prolegomena to every future metaphysic that will be able to appear as science, as a clarification to his previous works, and out of seeming confusion of his initial concepts. This was a follow-up after his critique of pure reason. He proclaimed that there was no need for everybody to study metaphysics, subtly admitting the complexities and difficulty of his writings. Critique of Practical Reason, 1788. Kant turned towards morality after his critique of pure reason made the concept of free will questionable, thus undermining morality. His idea was that while morals may derive from experience, this would reduce moral considerations to a purely subjective and fleeting experience. He needed a system that had something that is innate and unmoving. He proposed a universal moral sense in our psychology, which was not based upon personal experience. He claimed this sense was innate. He framed this as a categorical imperative, to act rightly because it was right to act. He explored such questions, including how if an action of yours were to become universal, and how that may change society for the better or worse. People should not just be seen as objects, as tools, but with sacred value, in which the dignity of man was important. He also stated how this freedom would show how we aren't mere automatons who do not have free choice. Free thought and having meaning to them would indicate meaning itself, which can give value to our lives, and how it further justifies how we believe our soul to be immortal. Critique of Judgment, 1790. In his Critique of Judgment, he considered the power of understanding experiences via a lens, such as an idea, a principle, or a rule. All things must have a sense of beauty in the chaos of complexity. Kant talked about concepts of beauty and the sublime, essentially experiences stemming from a purely aesthetic perspective, the joy of observation for observation's sake, instead of personal gain. There was the pleasure of viewing something beautiful in a harmonious way, and when experiencing a sublime sensation of immense power that overwhelms your senses. It may exist anywhere from artwork to the skies as long as something of greatness was experienced. Religion and Reason, 1793. Here, Kant explored the human condition, which can be corrupted, with or without culture. In an uncivilized state, where all is violence and destruction, he was left to wonder if such a state of affairs was the path, which must lead back to his concerns about his sense of morality. He believed such evil to be based on necessities of our old ways, in terms of survival, which then turned into vices of our times. However, his goal was that through time it could be controlled. What was most important in the long run was moral good, the cultivation of character, which cannot be dictated via any kind of faith or divine intervention. He felt that human beings should be looking for things which have the most impact on the human experience, not rituals and hollow structures. It was through organized religion where he had no issues, as long as it provided the tools to develop faith, maintain community and structure with their belief in the scriptures. He believed it would ultimately create influence and promote action, which he valued as long as these systems did not become corrupt and power-hungry and a prison to the human mind. Instead, he called to the purity of thought through reason, in which that could become the path of morality. His approach had great resistance from the king, and in response he simply sought to express his need for freedom in thought. His condition to this all was that he simply needed to stay quiet, and as such the propitiatory reply came about. Regardless, he would inevitably win out in the end, where his influence caused a silent revolution through thought. The vision of the future, perpetual peace. Kant, in his practical approach to politics, advocated for a vision of world peace, which can be found in republics. A focus is placed upon the citizens that are involved with states, where they ultimately are the deciding factors on if wars must be made, and how those who are the first to call war are typically those who would least suffer as a result. Instead of those self-interested people being the deciding factors, it must instead be the community, as it may act with more empathy. This, he states, as a way toward an international law with a federation of free states. His theory suggested that states should adopt codes that match those found with the citizen, and that the ones adhering to these rules should be the ones who are in charge. This can serve to limit self-serving wars. It would not be perfect. It was more along the lines of a governing principle for the masses. He also had reservations of the power that full democracy held, in particular if the masses were not educated enough, that it can bring a great imbalance, as with the former state. Rather, these concepts must be made known to the people to give more control over themselves in the process. Therefore, to uphold their worth, a state should be a way to have a structure toward more thought, where we should not blindly look for patriotic citizens, but ones who seek critical thinking instead. Posthumous legacy. His physique is easily summarized as a small man with a curved spine. His health, managed due to routine and consistent scheduled habits, served as a significant characteristic. Kant may have limited social interaction, and with a focus only on one or two pupils and exclusively no interaction with women, there was much generosity, intellect, and standards shown towards his companions. A moral compass and high standards allowed him to fulfill his goal for the betterment of humanity. Through such, he stopped going to church and vowed to not say anything that was not what he believed to be the truth. He had this desire to push human limits, and through his knowledge, he strove for more. He was never satisfied. Upon his death, he had confused people by leaving posthumous publications. And in such a work, God became something akin to the idea of being fictional, but a crucial function for the moral imperative of belief, and that should indicate something to be used but not as a thing itself, is when he became known for being a Copernican thinker. And how we understand knowledge, by placing the mind at the center, rather than outside experience. And because of his influences toward idealisms, metaphysics, and his idea on the human will, as well as influences in German art and literature, is greatly important and undeniable. Through such deep analysis to personal truths, even though it was more theoretical in nature, one might be quick to deem his work as unromantic. His ideas, however, had helped pave the way for romantics nonetheless. From Königsberg, through careful, deliberate thought, a simple man was able to change perspectives on truth and on morality. He did, regardless of the reader's comprehension, impact this world for generations. He was a truly intellectual man. Kant's influence extends far beyond his time. His impact continues to mold the perspective of many modern thinkers. He sought a life of purpose, and always did his best in doing his duty, all with clear direction. Perhaps through examining his work, we too can find such similar drive toward meaning for the human experience, while making a better place for others in our world. Chapter 22. Roads to Weimar. In the annals of German history, a unique cultural phenomenon unfolded, not in the established capitals of power, but within the unassuming village of Weimar, the Athens of Germany. Germany, unlike its unified neighbors, was then a mosaic of fragmented territories, lacking a singular center of wealth and influence. While cities like Berlin and Leipzig bore the scars of war, and Hamburg busied itself with commercial endeavors in the arts, the village of Weimar remained a tranquil backwater. By 1774, its population hovered around 6,200 souls. Goethe would later wryly refer to it as a town of 10,000 poets with few inhabitants. Yet, this seemingly unremarkable locale became the crucible of a literary and philosophical renaissance. Anna Amalie, the Dowager Duchess and aunt to Frederick the Great, possessed an uncanny ability to perceive the latent potential of Weimar. She recognized, long before others did, the need to move the culture into German rather than French, and opened her doors to literary figures and intellectuals. The invitation extended to Christoph Martin Wieland in 1772 to tutor her sons proved to be a catalyst, setting into motion a wave of creative energy. Her salon became a nexus of ideas, and romance also became the playground of intellectual endeavors. This unique environment empowered and attracted many creative and powerful individuals. Karl August, ascending to the duchy at the young age of 18, embraced his role as a patron of the arts with zeal and vigor. After making the necessary arrangements to his personal life, he summoned Johann Wolfgang von Goethe to his court, creating an environment for cultivation and learning. He was a man of action, deeply involved in all aspects of the kingdom, but he would ensure the highest of qualities of the place. His strength and attention became the foundations upon which it would become known for intellectual growth. As noted by Madame de Stael, it was this strong leadership, along with that of his mother, that turned Weimar into a center for German literature. They were strong and driven people that had tangible results for all. Wieland, the voice of reason. Christoph Martin Wieland's life was a testament to intellectual curiosity and the pursuit of personal growth. The son of a pastor, Wieland explored theological studies and immersed himself in poetry before being drawn to Voltaire's ideas. A large library owned by Count von Stadium became the seed for him to develop a new point of view through the discovery of new books, where he abandoned piety for satire. He challenged the status quo and embraced new ways of thinking, where even translating 20 of Shakespeare's plays allowed him to move the German theater from French standards. His epic, Agathon, explored the trials of an Athenian man striving to remain virtuous amid the temptations of earthly pleasure. It conveyed important philosophical principles and explored the idea of self-governance and the focus required for a life to come into fruition. Goethe, the boundless soul. Goethe emerged as a singular force of intellect and passion. Born in Frankfurt, his childhood was a complex blend of parental influences, his driven, harsh father and a loving and poetic mother, which cultivated both sensitivity and an insatiable desire to experience the world fully. His early years involved exploration of languages, music, and art, as well as a series of youthful romances that would forever shape his work. He was not content with the ordinary and could not contain his desire to be made into something better. His drive was what he used to create in different art forms. His studies in Leipzig became more of a tour of exploration for history rather than sticking to law. Later in his life, he considered himself to be an enemy of religion, an outspoken atheist who embraced the philosophical ideas of Spinoza. In him, Goethe found an answer. God was all things in one, an encompassing force of nature and being, a powerful force that was mother and the means by which life was born. Before solidifying the bonds of love with Lily Schoenemann, Goethe ultimately decided freedom was more important to his existence. Destiny took him by the hand and led him to Carl August, finally ending his search to become the greatest author of his time when finally invited to reside in Weimar. Chapter 23, Weimar in Flower. Wieland, 1775 to 1813. Wieland, whose visage was described by Mozart as frightfully ugly, with a pockmarked face and prominent nose, nonetheless captivated observers as if he had dropped from heaven. Wieland, a proponent of live and let live, garnered the respect of the older Goethe. The two poets mutually supported each other's endeavors, Wieland extolling Schiller for displaying confidence, love, and esteem. These men agreed to collaborate, marking a judicious move in their literary careers. In 1798, Wieland foresaw chaos in France, anticipating Bonaparte as the figure destined to seize power. This astute prediction was validated when Napoleon, upon encountering Wieland, expressed his admiration for his wisdom, a significant recognition of his perspicacity. Goethe, in a tribute following Wieland's passing, acknowledged that his life demonstrated a harmonious balance of tranquility and activity. With remarkable deliberation, devoid of passionate striving or lamentation, he contributed extensively to the intellectual culture of the nation. Herder in History, 1777 to 1803. Herder, a speaker of considerable eloquence, was known to be swayed by intense feelings. Employed as a chaplain and superintendent with the additional responsibility of overseeing schools, he was an individual of considerable energy. For 3 years, Goethe and Herder avoided contact with one another. Despite their differences, Herder and Wieland developed a friendship and jointly hosted discussions within Anna Amelie's salon. Herder's Volkslieder initiated the Romantic movement. While Goethe inclined towards classical ideals, Herder promoted medieval faith, legends, and practices as a rebellion against 18th century thought. Herder argued in an essay that poetry was diminished in vitality as it had become overly structured rather than a free flow of thought. He proposed interpreting the book of Genesis as a work of poetry rather than science, claiming poetry could convey truths through symbolism comparable to those of fact. A pantheist, he stated that I do not recognize an extra-mundane God, in agreement with Lessing's philosophy. This conviction did not extend to his clerical writing, in which he still acknowledged Christ's miracles and the soul's immortality. In his seminal work, Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, he posited life did not evolve from matter, for matter itself is alive. Body and mind are not separate and opposed substances, they are two forms of one force. This seminal work delved into the issue of mankind's evolution from primates and, simultaneously, said mankind was destined for reason and freedom, and destined to immortality. He considered large states to be detrimental, promoting inequality and fostering the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Societies progressed at their own rate through an increasing accumulation of human heritage. Dismissing Kant's writings as monstrous jugglery of words with metaphysical phantoms, he was vehement about Kant's philosophical divergence from his own perspective. Herder possessed an ambition that encouraged striving for knowledge in the face of opposition. When reading Die Natürliche Tochter, he delivered a pun to Goethe about his child, stating, "I like your natural son better than your natural daughter." He died alone at his residence in Weimar, following an irreparable falling out with Goethe, leaving behind a legacy of significant intellectual contributions. Goethe Counselor, 1775-86. Goethe's arrival in Weimar generated a mix of admiration and apprehension, with the court immediately perceiving him to be the Duke's closest associate and the object of the good lady's affections. His love for revelry and hunting led some to claim his pagan beliefs and romantic dreams corrupted a virtuous prince. When he constructed a garden residence, his previous relationships were strained by public resentment. Yet his influence increased, and he was regarded less as a poet and more as a trusted advisor. Goethe in Italy, 1786-88. Goethe traveled incognito as he wished to be freed from the inconveniences of fame. He entered Italy at the age of 37 with the bright expectancy of youth. Immediately upon his entry he declared, "I believe in God again." He embraced the populace and wrote about the nature of Italy. Through his experiences, he expressed that Palladio has opened the road for me to every art, demonstrating that accomplishment and inspiration work harmoniously together. His time in Rome left an indelible mark. The history of the whole world attaches itself to this spot, and I reckon a true new birth since the day I entered Rome. I think I am changed to the very marrow. Goethe, Waiting, 1788-94. Upon returning, he found that his position as a council member had been reduced, and he held more of an advisory ministerial role. He discovered his public recognition had begun to wane as others, such as Schiller, acquired attention. Christiane Valpius became involved with Goethe, she who possessed a fresh spirit, her simple mind, her budding womanhood. He welcomed her into his home as his lover despite public outcry. He was never known to surrender his ambitions. This relationship brought a son to his family. Amidst these events, Goethe still dedicated his time to study. As his career moved along, the French Revolution created political tensions that led Goethe and Karl to approach war with deliberation and stating that people were running with bellows in their hands, so they must look for cold water jugs. His next steps came from his desire to match the youthful ambition of Schiller. He shrank from the crowd, revealing a timidity that allowed for his peace only to exist at home. Schiller Waiting, 1787-94. Schiller had made a negative assessment of Goethe, observing that Goethe was squandering a salary of $1,800 there, and here they have to work double tides for half the money. He recognized, however, Goethe's most clear judgment, great depth of feeling, and the purest sentiments, adding that as a man of business, Goethe is more deserving of admiration than as a poet. He regarded Goethe as being so far ahead of me as he perceived their paths to be diametrically opposed. Goethe agreed. Their interactions demonstrated that Little Athens was unable to accommodate both of their pursuits. In a method to create distance, he aided Schiller's professorship at Jena. Schiller stated that it would make me unhappy to be a great deal in Goethe's society. He is hateful to me for this reason, though I cannot do otherwise than admire his mind and think nobly of him. Regardless, he managed several feats as a professor at Jena. His three-part series, History of the 30 Years' War, gave him a following and enhanced his reputation for written works. Once finished, he enjoyed the comforts of a home life as he married Lotta, finally feeling fulfilled. He suffered 2 instances of a catarrhal fever which nearly led him to his death. Chapter 24, Goethe's Nestor. Goethe and Napoleon. During a tumultuous period in European history, dominated by the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte, Goethe found his own life intersecting with these monumental events. When Napoleon's troops sacked Weimar, Goethe's residence became a focal point. Instead of succumbing to despair, Goethe secured his home and protection directly through Napoleon's decree, a testament not to charity but to the profound respect for his intellectual stature. The directive was clear: the distinguished scholar was not to be disturbed. This recognition underscored the eminence Goethe had achieved. Their interactions were not as equals, but as men of significant influence, with Napoleon bestowing praise upon Goethe and inviting him to Paris for a larger view of the world. Even after Napoleon's downfall, Goethe could not harbor animosity toward the French, focusing instead on a grander scope encompassing the tensions between civilization and barbarism. Goethe viewed the world with a vision that surpassed petty conflicts, understanding the pivotal role of exceptional men in shaping history. He famously stated, "How could I write songs of hatred when I felt no hate?" The Natural Scientist. It is critical to understand that Goethe was not exclusively a literary figure. His interest and devotion to the natural sciences was considerable, with his devotion exceeding that even of his writing. His exploration of meteorology, mineralogy, optics, and botany illustrates a tireless commitment to knowledge, characterized by the establishment of labs for study. He challenged conventional scientific understanding, positing that color is determined by both physical elements as well as how the eye perceives them. His theories, though not always accepted by his contemporaries, didn't diminish his resolve. The pragmatist. Goethe challenged purely theoretical academics by insisting that the unfathomable is of no practical value. He argued against both materialist and idealist positions, referring to both as the necessary twin ingredients of the universe, asserting the need for a balanced view. He understood balance in himself was a pathway to progression. His religious beliefs varied, but his foundational self-confidence never faltered. Furthermore, he recognized the importance of the past to give an idea to current and future generations, as a truly gifted man will naturally incline. To Goethe, an existence needs a higher form of action in order to improve oneself and be free from mediocrity. One needs a proper inspiration. Final act. By the conclusion of his life, Goethe had a full breadth of experiences behind him, with his older peers fading away, as it always must for those at an advanced age. He persisted and sought comfort through the act of creation, as, "Fortunate is he whose world lies in his home." Goethe, far from creating a superficial interpretation of life, acknowledged it directly. All life looks like some malignant disease. He continued his act of creation till his final moments, and even as his final breath is being drawn from him, distorted in pain, still demanded, "Let in more light." Chapter 25, The Jews. The struggle for existence. History is a battlefield where survival is the ultimate victory. Will Durant observed this through Rousseau's claim, "The Jewish people outlasted mighty empires, their strength rooted in enduring laws, older than those of Solon, Numa, or Lycurgus." Durant argued that their survival came not only from wisdom but from a remarkable system, a code of conduct that served as both religion and government. This constitution, with the Talmud as its supreme court, bound them together in a world that was often hostile. But even this resilience faced immense challenges. Durant pondered whether the decline of Christian orthodoxy had lessened antisemitism. Yet, he noted how personal grievances often obscured reason. Even Voltaire, a critic of Christian bigotry, turned against the Jews after poor financial dealings, labeling them with unfounded vitriol. A Catholic priest called this irrationality out, showcasing how prejudice could poison even enlightened minds. However, Durant reminded us that many French thinkers stood with the Jews against such hatred. Jewish financiers, despite systemic discrimination, played a vital role in stabilizing economies, proving their capacity when given room to operate. Spain's Inquisition tells another familiar story, persecuting Jews well into the 18th century. Laws like the purity of blood statutes excluded Jews from positions of power, a sign of leaders clinging to fragility instead of fostering strength. In contrast, Portugal saw reform under the Marquis of Pombal, who overturned such oppressive laws. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Pius VI renewed disabilities on the Jewish people. In Austria, Emperor Joseph II sought integration for the Jews but faced resistance. Elsewhere, Catherine the Great divided lands for Jewish self-governance, granting tools for survival despite outside hostility. Durant highlighted moments of Jewish strength in adversity, like Meyer Amschel Rothschild, who built a financial empire amidst Germany's restrictive laws. In England, Jews proved indispensable during national crises, with leaders like Samson Gideon bolstering financial systems in uncertain times. Yet, they faced backlash from the very society they helped save. The mystic solace. Under relentless oppression, some turned to mysticism for solace. Hasidism, founded by Israel ben Eliezer, found God in nature in the present moment, offering comfort in hardship. Yet, Durant argued that such retreats, while spiritually enriching, lacked the systemic strength needed for lasting progress. False messiahs, like Jacob Frank, only led to confusion and fragmentation. Moses Mendelssohn, a beacon of conviction. Amid the struggle rose a figure of transformative clarity, Moses Mendelssohn. From humble beginnings, he climbed to greatness through relentless self-discipline and learning. Like Maimonides before him, he built character, cultivated wisdom, and stood by his principles. Dubbed the German Plato, Mendelssohn blended faith with intellectual freedom, inspiring many. His book Jerusalem advocated for emancipation through understanding, even earning praise from Kant. Yet, despite his brilliance, even he faced resistance from within his own community. Some rabbis rejected his work, and his children converted to Christianity. Toward freedom. Durant described the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, as a pivotal moment. Some embraced modernity, others clung to tradition. This tension reflects the difficulty of balancing progress with identity. Those who acted boldly, embracing education, commerce, and reform, laid the groundwork for emancipation. By the French Revolution, civil rights were granted to Jews, marking a step forward, though often at the price of hard-earned self-reliance. Napoleon's conquests further opened doors, but as Durant noted, true freedom comes not from external forces, but from internal strength. Chapter 26, From Geneva to Stockholm. The Swiss, 1754-98. The Swiss, weren't they? One might gaze upon their towering mountains and see serenity, yet beneath the picturesque peaks lay a fractured society. Race against race, language against language, religion against religion, canton against canton. A mosaic of contention, squabbling over what so often proved trivial. Yet amidst this chaos was a dream, a confederation, as they declared. A confederation of states, independent in their internal affairs but united in their relations with the world. A lofty aspiration to weave unity from discord. Commerce thrived. Textiles from Geneva and watches from Neuchâtel brought wealth, the universal motive, but wealth divides. Oligarchies rose, concentrating power. Gibbon, observing from Lausanne, saw through their facade, the rich holding the poor in poverty to keep control. The French Revolution loomed, a storm against which Swiss patricians stood no chance. The lower classes, the natifs, sought influence, demanding the right to vote. Voltaire, ever observant, noted, "You are the majority in this industrious community, and yet you are enslaved." In 1782, revolt erupted, brief and futile. It was the French Revolution's momentum that brought real change, sweeping away the old order. Enter Johann Pestalozzi, a man of ideas. He sought to reshape minds, not laws, promoting education as a panacea. But Goethe criticized his methods, calling them a breeding ground for chaos. When the French Revolutionary Army arrived, the Swiss, disorganized, embraced them. The Dutch, 1715–95. The Dutch, a nation of canals and commerce that ships docked at the doorsteps of immaculate streets. Lady Montague marveled at the shops, filled with fine goods, a testament to the Dutch mastery of trade, yet wealth came at a price. The War of Spanish Succession drained their strength, robbing them of trade routes and prosperity. By 1763, Boswell saw the aftermath. Multitudes of poor creatures starving in idleness. Banks grew rich, lending at high interest, while the masses languished. Still, the Dutch adapted. They led Europe in scientific farming, reclaiming land and their place in commerce. Religious factions coexisted peacefully enough, and brilliant assemblies flourished. Politically, unity crumbled. Citizens were excluded from administration, poverty and desperation took root, and control slipped away. By 1795, the French invaded, forming the Batavian Republic. William V fled, a ruler undone by inaction. The Danes, 1715–97. In Denmark, serfs toiled beneath the weight of aristocracy and the church. Without a middle class to innovate, the nation stagnated. Censorship stifled progress, ensuring that dissent remained hidden, yet voices emerged. Holberg wielded satire like a weapon, exposing societal flaws with laughter. His work preserved Denmark's essence, much like Pompeii reveals ancient Rome. The Danes abolished the slave trade, a progressive move amidst regressive systems. Christian Vale sought global commerce, while his son Frederick V invited poets, artists, and scientists into the fold. The Swedes, 1718–97 Sweden, here the tale becomes one of ambition and consequence. Charles XII, obsessed with glory, drained the nation's resources. A new constitution ceded power to a Riksdag, inviting chaos. Neighboring powers supported this weak system, ensuring Sweden posed no threat. When factions like the Hats and Caps rose, they clashed, leaving the nation stagnant. Adolphus Frederick, a powerless king, presided over a fractured state. But then came Louisa Ulrika, who embraced Enlightenment ideals and inspired her son, Gustavus III. Gustavus was a man of ambition, culture, and strategy. He studied the great leaders of history, determined to leave his mark. With France's financial support, he overthrew Sweden's constitution in a bloodless coup. Hailed as a liberator, he reformed trade, industry, and culture, earning Voltaire's praise, yet his boldness had limits. When Gustavus dismissed the Riksdag and declared war on Russia, his enemies multiplied. Though victorious at sea, his domestic opponents plotted. At a masquerade ball, Ankerström shot him. Even in death, Gustavus showed mercy, recommending clemency for his assassin. Chapter 27, The Industrial Revolution. Antecedents. The foundations of industrialization. England's rise as the cradle of the Industrial Revolution was no accident. It was the result of unique circumstances that set it apart from the rest of Europe. While continental nations were locked in costly land wars, England focused inward, consolidating wealth and power. Its naval dominance transformed the English Channel into a fortress, protecting its shores and ensuring global trade supremacy. Through colonial conquests, England secured a treasure trove of raw materials from lands like India, Canada, and the Caribbean. These colonies became pipelines, supplying resources and consuming goods in a one-sided economic dance. This era also witnessed the birth of the projector, an early entrepreneur eager to innovate and profit. Meanwhile, vast fortunes amassed through privateering and the transatlantic slave trade fueled England's financial engine. Banks flourished, wealth multiplied, and capital found new ways to power the economy. As the countryside mechanized, displaced rural workers flocked to cities, forming an ever-growing labor pool. England embraced practical science, prioritizing innovations that served industry over abstract theory. Even the government, benefiting from industrial profits, avoided regulation, allowing free enterprise to thrive. Economic, geographic, and social forces combined to make England a fertile ground for industrialization. Components, the mechanisms of industry. Industrialization's engine was fueled by key components that transformed production. Iron and coal became the lifeblood of progress. Innovations in refining coal and producing iron spurred infrastructure growth, paving the way for railways and bridges. Transportation revolutionized commerce. Canals slashed costs and sped up the movement of goods, connecting the North Sea to the Irish Sea. These waterways became vital trade arteries, enabling industrial growth across the Isles. Mechanization swept through industries, especially textiles. Inventions like the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the mechanical loom turned cottage industries into factory powerhouses. Steam power added a transformative spark. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine, supported by visionaries like Boulton, tripled efficiency. Steam engines powered factories, transportation, and a newfound ability to manipulate time itself. Factories centralized production, uniting labor, machinery, and raw materials in hubs of productivity. Capitalism emerged as the driving force, reshaping society around profit and creating a new hierarchy of wealth and labor. Consequences: the harsh reality of industrialization. The benefits of industrialization came at a cost, borne largely by the workers. In factories, humans became cogs in a relentless machine of production. 12 to 14-hour days were the norm, with wages barely enough for survival. Exploitation was rampant, with children toiling in unsafe conditions under brutal overseers. Laborers lacked protection, and the promise of progress often left them more impoverished than before. Despair crept into the working class, as poverty and dehumanization took their toll. Many sought solace in vices, as their lives became cycles of toil and hardship. Resistance arose in the form of strikes, uprisings, and even machine breaking, but such acts were met with repression. Trade unions were outlawed, and dissent was crushed, cementing the power imbalance. Consequences: reshaping society. The Industrial Revolution redefined every aspect of life, leaving a legacy that still shapes the world today. Traditional guilds were swept away by industrial capitalism, rendering age-old trades obsolete. Agriculture mechanized, and entire sectors shifted, forcing a dependence on new systems. Science and technology flourished, funded for their practical applications to industry. Progress drove innovation, but it also pushed aesthetics and art aside in favor of efficiency. Britain's dominance grew, with its empire harnessing global resources and markets. Yet, this globalization left nations interdependent, blurring the lines of autonomy. Urbanization transformed cities into sprawling industrial centers, often at the cost of livable conditions. The rise of industrial capacity even reshaped warfare, as military strength became tied to production. Mass production flooded markets with affordable goods, creating consumer societies. Yet, this shift devalued the artistry and morality of earlier eras. The era also challenged religious and ethical norms, as materialism and self-interest became dominant values. Chapter 28: The Political Drama. First, one must understand the playing field. England was a constitutional monarchy, wherein the king, George III, was not an absolute ruler. He was bound by laws and traditions, the most significant being Parliament. Parliament possessed considerable power, approving laws and taxes in essence, wielding the power of the purse. The Constitution at the time was not a single written document, it was a combination of precedents, rulings, and statutes. Notably, the Magna Carta had established limits to royal power, and the Bill of Rights further delineated the constraints placed upon the monarch. These instruments kept the king's actions bound by law. Royal declarations were not absolute without parliamentary consent. The social structure was quite stratified. The nobility, peers, peeresses, and bishops held the highest positions in society. With their hereditary titles such as dukes and earls, they held political control through wealth and inherited prestige. Below them were the lesser nobles, knights, and squires. The gentry was the most populous class of landowners. The composition of parliament was determined by electoral districts encompassing counties and boroughs. Voting was influenced by wealth and manipulation of representation. Women, Catholics, and anyone not aligned with the Anglican Church were barred from political engagement. Major landowners often selected members of parliament, and in boroughs, these positions were frequently sold to the highest bidder. Cash transactions were common, as was evidenced in Sudbury Borough. In such rotten boroughs, men of wealth like Lord Camelford could secure the election of his personal staff, even a butler. Thus, the system of checks and balances was not an equal division of power. Rather, power, wealth, and tradition were closely linked. In 1761, the House of Commons consisted of 558 members, 45 from Scotland, 94 from English and Welsh counties, 415 from boroughs, and 2 each from universities. The House of Lords had 224 members, both temporal and spiritual, peers and bishops. Power resided within them, and challenges to their governance risked consequences. The king, despite having royal prerogatives, could not enact laws nor raise taxes without Parliament's consent. The Tories, protectors of landed interests, and the Whigs, somewhat concerned with business needs, were both ultimately quite conservative, overlooking the needs of the common citizenry. Here were the main figures who shaped this period. George III was a British-born king. He was determined to assert royal authority. His education was not extensive, and his temperament was noted to be obstinate. Under his reign, the country went through great changes. The American and French revolutions tested his resolve. William Pitt was a prominent figure in Parliament. A master strategist and public speaker, Pitt was not loved for being a man of the people, but sought to position England at the forefront of the world stage. Ultimately, his pride and failing health hindered him when in competition with the king for power. Edmund Burke, an Irishman, entered the scene as a figure viewed with suspicion by some. His initial publication, A Vindication of Natural Society, was regarded with unease as anarchistic. This reputation was soon rejected in an effort to enter mainstream politics. In another publication, Burke wrote of beauty and theorized how it brings mankind to perceive truths. Burke was renowned for his eloquence and intellectual prowess. There was conflict when George III tried to increase his own authority. He believed the king should select ministers and influence policy rather than let the Whig families have complete power over governance. He began by removing Pitt, who had amassed significant political influence, as well as the costly war with France that Pitt had engaged in. The king pushed for peace, negotiating a treaty behind the scenes to finish that expenditure which had caused him such concern. Parliament resisted these measures as they had fought for centuries, safeguarding their own established system of checks and balances against the powers of the king. To some, George III was attempting to imitate monarchs like Charles I. The Whigs attempted to hold on to their votes to protect their influence in Parliament from the actions of the king. The ensuing turmoil included ministerial changes and ongoing power plays. The tensions within England had their repercussions on its colonies. England saw the colonies as primarily instruments of commerce and imposed many restrictions. American commerce was limited with restrictions against commerce with anyone outside England and not being able to manufacture certain products, resulting in economic hardship. The imposition of taxes by Parliament like the stamp tax and taxes on tea proved a catalyst for rebellion in the American colonies. They had no say in the political power that taxed them. American protests claimed their rights as Englishmen without proper representation. When protests occurred, more power was held onto and even more taxes put in place until they could take it no more. Even Chatham, though considered a war hawk, viewed the taxing of Americans without a fair right to their internal taxation unjust. Burke argued that the taxation of America was nothing more than an assertion of power over the people. Ultimately, his argument did not prevail, as Parliament's view was more concerned with the risk of losing power as the colonies gaining any agency of self-determination, as that may spread into more uprising. Despite Burke's counsel, taxes increased, culminating in the Boston Tea Party. The American Declaration of Independence resulted in war, eventually ending with a British defeat at Yorktown. The issue was fundamentally about wealth, who had it, who made it, and who spent it. The perceived injustice, the lack of political representation, when Parliament controlled the entirety of the American colonial legislative branch, was the fuel to its demise and led ultimately to a long and difficult decline in British dominance. All this under the administration of North, who realized the colonies should never have been forced to comply with an unrepresentative English government. While dealing with American chaos, issues emerged in India. The British East India Company had a trade monopoly and took great advantage of the local population with their shady practices in excessive land acquisition and manipulation, which brought famine and killed millions. Robert Clive's greed was legendary with his plundering actions in India. The corruption and unchecked power back home highlighted an inability of government to take appropriate responsibilities in an empire they held. Burke's reaction to the French Revolution drove a wedge within his own political circle. Burke publicly disagreed with Fox's views because his personal philosophy was opposed to the revolution. Equality, mob rule, religion, order, and tradition were crucial to preventing an English social collapse and a lapse into anarchy. It was more about a threat that the revolution posed for England to take down its own tradition and bring mob rule. Burke was fearful, and his beliefs were that change was undesirable. Order must remain stable, despite benefiting a minority. His vision lacked depth and nuance on complex social structures, power, and progress, as it was static rather than moving forward. Burke viewed the state as a relationship across the generations, keeping all forms of government and structures to maintain stability. However, in practice, these views would create chaos for increasingly more divergent demands for changes in society that came with the modern man. Most figures of this era either faded away or were defeated. Pitt, depleted and overcome by the political battles he had sought for so long, died early. King George's story concluded in madness. In the end, the English citizenry pitied his plight. Ironically, at that point, public sentiment for the king improved as they became more aware of how devastating the chase for power could become. The English political system at this time saw the public gaining power against traditional power institutions, as the institutions fell by their own failures and the self-serving natures of the political actors who held the seats of governance. Chapter 29. The English People. The men, robust and leonine, ready to dominate but often undone by excess, succumbing to corpulence and gout. The women, by contrast, were exquisite, their beauty likened to poems wrapped in silk, their hair adorned like flourishing gardens. Yet, even in their finery, both genders reflected a society caught between opulence and decay. Fashion itself told a story of evolution. Men shed their powdered wigs, their breeches narrowing to reveal calves and ankles, marking a subtle shift toward practicality. It was a society where conformity, strangely, offered a form of freedom, provided it aligned with personal joy. But beneath the elegance lurked filth. Rivers, described by Durant as drainage canals, were undrinkable. Water, when it arrived in homes, came sporadically and from dubious sources. Cleanliness was often neglected, with society turning to alcohol as both escape and sustenance. Beer was food, whiskey a fiery comfort, and drunkenness a venial sin, indulged even by the so-called decent folk. Johnson himself recalled nights when all of Lichfield's respectable citizens were drunk. At the heart of the upper class was a culture of intellect. Joshua Reynolds' gatherings elevated conversation to an art form, rivaling the salons of Paris. Yet, for all its brilliance, this was also a society of contradictions. George Selwyn, a man of sharp humor and darker tastes, embodied these paradoxes, expelled from Oxford for sacrilege, yet thriving within the establishment. Morality, Durant observes, was a spectrum. Adam Smith noted two systems, the righteous code of the devout and the looser ethics of the wealthy. John Wesley lamented the smuggling, corruption, and false oaths that plagued society. Yet, amidst this chaos, Durant saw a profound vitality, a lusty vigor that defied the decay. Social hypocrisies abounded, double standards flourished. Adultery among men was excused, while women faced death for similar transgressions. Homosexuality, though publicly condemned, persisted in secret. Even so, this was a society that managed to function, governing nations, waging wars, and thriving economically. The contradictions were glaring, yet they lived with them, unapologetically. The darker side of progress lay in industrial exploitation. Children swept chimneys, slaves were traded as commodities, yet voices of change rose. The Quakers and William Wilberforce fought to abolish the slave trade, planting the seeds of justice that would bear fruit decades later. Religion too played a dual role. For the poor, it was sacred. For the elite, a social function. Free thinkers faded from prominence, yet a new moral philosophy arose. Jeremy Bentham, championing utilitarianism, sought the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He rejected tradition for innovation, laying the groundwork for future reforms in law, voting, and sanitation. In the arts, the theater mirrored society's vibrancy. David Garrick revolutionized acting, embodying characters rather than merely reciting them. Sarah Siddons brought historical accuracy to the stage. London's playhouses buzzed with life, bridging social classes and shared amusement. And then there was London itself, a city of malice and magnificence, of filth and grandeur. Streets were filthy, the air choked with coal dust. Yet the Thames bustled with ships from every corner of the world, a testament to the city's commerce and vitality. Taverns and parks pulsed with life, where the wealthy mingled with the poor, and the boundaries of class blurred, if only briefly. Johnson summed it up best. When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. Chapter 30, The Age of Reynolds. Joshua Reynolds. Reynolds, the epitome of self-made success, climbed from obscurity to renown. He traveled to Rome in 1750, studying the great masters to absorb their techniques. Upon returning, he discovered the public's appetite for portraits, capturing the essence of his subjects with unmatched skill. He immortalized everyone, from merchants to aristocrats, turning each into a symbol of dignity and grandeur. His portrait of Lord Heathfield, bold in British red, holding the key to Gibraltar, exemplified his ability to convey power. Women, too, found their grace preserved under his brush, soft and timeless. Reynolds earned a staggering £16,000 annually, his studio a hub for luminaries like Goldsmith and Boswell. Oxford crowned him an honorary lawyer, though his name needed no further embellishment. As president of the Royal Academy, he urged artists to study the classics before daring to innovate, declaring, "Labor is the only price of solid fame." When he passed in 1792, his legacy burned as brightly as ever. Thomas Gainsborough. Gainsborough, Reynolds' fiery counterpart, followed his heart more than convention. From an early age, he preferred sketching trees and cattle to academic pursuits. "I paint portraits to live, landscapes because I love them, and music because I must," he once said. Unlike Reynolds, Gainsborough loathed the formalities of portraiture, though his talent brought fame regardless. As his health waned, Gainsborough found solace in reconciliation, penning a letter to Reynolds before his death in 1788. In a final act of camaraderie, Reynolds helped carry Gainsborough's body to its resting place. Though their rivalry ended, Gainsborough's name endures as one of England's first true artistic giants. Chapter 31, England's Neighbours. Grattan's Ireland, a nation in chains. A land where death was not feared but welcomed, a merciful release from a life of unrelenting hardship. This was Ireland in 1764, as an English observer noted the desperate state of its peasantry. Their suffering began with the middlemen who bled them dry with rents, forcing families to survive on potatoes and little else. When restrictions on cattle exports to England were lifted in 1758, what seemed like opportunity turned into despair. Landlords, hungry for profit, converted fertile farmland into grazing pastures, leaving the peasantry poorer still. The population swelled, driven by a grim hope that more children might help pay the rent. Even Sir William Petty, a British economist, couldn't ignore their plight. Yet, amid this squalor, a flicker of resistance sparked. In the latter half of the century, after Henry Grattan's push against British restrictions, a middle class began to form. They turned to industries like linen and wool, and Dublin aspired to cultural greatness, even as its brightest minds emigrated for opportunity elsewhere. Religion played a defining role in Ireland's struggle. Catholics, the majority, were disenfranchised, denied leases longer than 31 years, and barred from Parliament. Catholic education was forbidden, leaving priests to seek knowledge abroad, hoping to bridge divides. By 1760, Ireland remained tightly controlled by a British-appointed Lord Lieutenant, and the Anglican elite dominated its parliament. But when the American Revolutionary War stretched Britain thin in 1776, the Irish saw their chance. Grattan led the Irish Volunteers, an armed force that stood boldly before Parliament with cannons labeled "Free Trade" or "This." Their defiance led to boycotts, and by 1779, Britain, vulnerable and cornered, repealed trade restrictions. In 1782, Ireland declared its independence, reluctantly acknowledged by Britain, but this victory was incomplete. Grattan's parliament achieved legislative independence but kept Catholics barred from parliamentary seats. As Grattan himself lamented, "Justice is not only blind, it limps." He passed away in 1820, long before the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829 fulfilled his dream of true equality. The Scottish Journey, Resilience Amidst Hardship. Across the Irish Sea, Scotland faced its own trials. In 1707, the Act of Union bound Scotland to England, dissolving its parliament into Westminster's grip. Some Scots integrated into this new British system, but for many, the sting of lost sovereignty lingered. By 1760, Scotland's 1.25 million people endured a harsh existence. In the Highlands, where winter spanned 8 brutal months, rents soared beyond reach. Mothers who bore 20 children often saw only 2 survive. Many fled this misery, seeking freedom in America, while others toiled in mines and salt pits until 1775. In contrast, the lowlands thrived. Factories fueled economic growth, cities like Glasgow blossomed, and Edinburgh emerged as an intellectual beacon. Education was Scotland's secret weapon. Institutions like the Royal Society of Edinburgh nurtured minds that would reshape the world. Even as the Kirk enforced rigid moral codes, the Scottish Enlightenment flourished, championing reason, innovation, and progress. Adam Smith. Among Scotland's greats stood Adam Smith, a man whose ideas would shape the modern world. In his Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, Smith explored how empathy guides moral judgments. But it was his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, that revolutionized economics. Smith advocated for free trade and competition, dismantling the mercantile system that choked progress. He argued that governments should protect society, ensure justice, and provide public goods, but never stifle innovation. Smith's vision of capitalism wasn't heartless. He believed in fairness, supported workers' unions, and abhorred corporate corruption. Chapter 32, The Literary Scene. The Press. This was a transformative time for the press in England, marked by a surge of vitality and newfound freedom. The printed word became the weapon of choice in the arena of public discourse. Political satire flowed from the presses at a breathtaking pace, wielded not just as commentary, but as a powerful tool to sway hearts and minds. Durant observed this phenomenon, noting how these publications evolved into instruments for advancing personal and political agendas. The press shattered old hierarchies, inviting voices from outside the traditional elite to reshape the narrative. Figures like John Wilkes, with his publication The North Briton, directly challenged royal authority. Will Durant writes, "They played for high stakes, and usually won." In this crucible of ideas, the press became more than a medium. It became a force for revolutionary change. Chapter 33, Samuel Johnson. Formative years, 1709 to 1746. Samuel Johnson's beginnings were anything but auspicious. Born a frail child to older parents, he was steeped in both physical hardship and spiritual fear. His devout Calvinist mother filled his early years with the dread of damnation, while scrofula left him partially blind, hard of hearing, and physically disfigured. Yet, these trials shaped his resilience. His father, a bookseller, ignited in him a love for literature that burned throughout his life. Still, formal schooling offered little but brutality. He once remarked, "My master whipped me very well. Without that, sir, I should have done nothing." Despite his brilliance, he left Oxford without a degree, setting him on a winding path of odd jobs and personal struggles. Marriage to Elizabeth Porter, a widow nearly twice his age, brought temporary financial stability, allowing him to open a school, but teaching bored him. Restless and ambitious, he left for London, determined to make his mark as an author. In London, he lived in poverty, his unkempt appearance earning derision as he moved between taverns and squalid lodgings. His struggles taught him firsthand the harsh realities of life, a truth he would later bring to his work. The dictionary, 1746 to 1755. When Johnson was asked to compile a dictionary of the English language, he initially refused. The task consumed 9 years and required a team of assistants. Johnson, ever the wit, defined a lexicographer as a harmless drudge, reflecting both the toil and the humility of his endeavor. Drawing from the English, he sought to create a linguistic foundation, treating words as the building blocks of thought. During this time, Johnson's frustrations poured into his poetry. His work, The Vanity of Human Wishes, revealed the inner turmoil of a man grappling with ambition and limitation. Yet, personal grief darkened these years. The death of his wife in 1752 plunged him into despair, and his home became a place of solitude. He sought solace in taverns, surrounded by friends but haunted by loneliness. The charmed circle. Despite his growing fame, Johnson's financial struggles persisted. He found some relief through friendships and occasional acts of charity, which he later paid forward generously. When his mother neared death, Johnson wrote the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, in a single week to pay for her funeral. With fame came opportunity. Johnson joined clubs where intellectuals debated over food and drink, solidifying his place in London's literary scene. Ursus Major. Physically imposing, Johnson's rugged appearance and brusque manners masked a deep well of kindness. He often helped the downtrodden, from housing a blind poet to rescuing a fallen prostitute. Despite his rough exterior, his heart was tender, his compassion driven by a profound understanding of human frailty. Johnson's intellect was formidable, and he rarely tolerated fools. His sharp wit and cutting debates earned him both admiration and fear. Yet, his generosity and integrity made him beloved by those who truly knew him. Release, 1781 to 1784. As friends passed away and his health declined, Johnson wrestled with loneliness and the fear of death. Yet, he sought connection, creating a club where anyone could hear him speak for a small fee. In his final months, he faced his mortality with courage, surrounded by loyal friends who came to bid him farewell. On December 13, 1784, Samuel Johnson passed away, leaving behind a legacy as one of England's greatest minds. Boswell Mortuoris. Johnson's story did not end with his death. Boswell, his devoted friend, immortalized him in The Life of Samuel Johnson, a biography. Chapter 34, The Final Glory. The Heirs to the Throne, 1754 to 1774. Louis XVI was never meant to rule. His father, Louis the Fat, struggled with indulgence and guilt, attempting to atone through labor and intellectual pursuits. Immersed in the writings of Rousseau and Montesquieu, he concluded that the monarch is nothing but the steward of the state's revenues. Louis, however, inherited little of his father's wisdom. An awkward man of simple tastes, Louis XVI enjoyed tools, books, and hunting over matters of state. In his quarters, he built a printing press. Not a throne for a ruler, but a hobbyist's delight. Louis XV foresaw his grandson's fate. Look at that big boy. He will be the ruin of France and of himself, but at least I won't live to see it. Meanwhile, across Europe, Maria Antonia, later known as Marie Antoinette, prepared for destiny. Sent from Austria as part of an arranged marriage, she learned French, refined her manners, and transformed into a queenly figure. Yet her journey to acceptance was fraught with missteps. She arrived to a cold court, bearing the weight of her lineage and the expectations of two nations. Her mother urged, "Be so good to the French that they can say I have sent them an angel." But the French court was skeptical, and whispers of wastefulness, laziness, and even a curse arose. For 7 years, her marriage to Louis remained unconsummated. Frustrated, Marie Antoinette turned to lavish spending, opera, and escapist pleasures. Upon Louis XV's death, the young couple faced a monumental challenge. "We are too young to rule," Louis cried, burdened by the crown. Despite their fears, the nation expected miracles. But miracles, history teaches us, are slow to arrive. The French government of the late 18th century was a paragon of dysfunction. It was not brutal like Prussia's, nor openly corrupt like England's, but it was hopelessly ineffective. A labyrinth of conflicting bureaucracies overlapped authority across fragmented regions. Justice was neither swift nor fair. Hereditary judges, nobles in robes, sought power over fairness. The courts, while proclaiming the equality of man, clung to aristocratic privilege. The king, theoretically absolute, wielded little real power. His court was a bloated spectacle, with thousands of officials draining state coffers. In 1780, court expenses alone devoured a tenth of the government's income, an unsustainable 50 million livres annually. The Virgin Queen. Marie Antoinette's reputation began to unravel as her spending habits came under public scrutiny. Her indulgences in fashion, jewels, and entertainments painted her as disconnected from France's struggles. Pamphlets gave her names like stifled sighs and masked desires. Her isolation at the Petit Trianon, a retreat styled as a pastoral haven, only fueled criticism. Lavish parties and questionable friendships, such as her bond with the opportunistic Yolande de Polignac, added to the scandal. Even her personal growth, becoming a devoted mother after years of public ridicule, failed to win back favor. She became a symbol of excess and called the Austrian bitch. Her every action, no matter how benign, was twisted into treachery. Le roi bonhomme. Louis XVI was a king of contrasts, kind yet indecisive, intellectual but inert. He preferred locks and keys to laws and governance. Even his queen chided him. Your hands are blackened with work that does not suit a king. Despite his flaws, Louis showed flashes of humanity. When ascending the throne, he told his minister, "Distribute 200,000 francs among the poor and take it from my pension if necessary." During an epidemic, he personally offered aid, earning the love of rural France. Frederick the Great called him a virtuous king, more dangerous to rivals than one of mere courage. Yet his virtues could not compensate for his inability to act decisively. Louis XVI embodied the tragedy of good intentions in the face of systemic decay. The Ministry of Turgot 1774 to 1776. In the face of France's fiscal crisis, Louis appointed the reformer Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. A visionary economist, Turgot aimed to curtail waste, reduce taxes, and abolish serfdom. He famously declared, "No bankruptcy, no increased taxes, no loans. Expenditure must fall below revenue." His reforms empowered farmers and merchants, promoting free trade and cutting privileges. Voltaire praised him, writing, "Nature made me live to see this day." But Turgot moved too boldly for a court mired in tradition. Opposition from nobles, clergy, and even the Queen grew insurmountable. Dismissed after just 2 years, Turgot's fall marked a missed opportunity for France. France and America. Amid its own struggles, France found inspiration across the Atlantic. The American Revolution embodied the ideals of liberty and self-governance. Through secret aid, France supported the Americans, hoping to weaken England while embracing revolutionary ideals. Yet this support came at a cost, further straining France's finances. The seeds of change were sown, but the harvest was still years away. The stage was set for revolution. The heirs to the throne, the ineffectual government, and the clash of ideals all pointed to an inevitable reckoning, and when it came, it would shake the world. The colonists, once a scattered and uncertain force, now stood united and resolute. Their cries for independence had transformed into a powerful roar, echoed across oceans and borders. France, emboldened by its philosophical ideals and strategic aims, emerged as a steadfast ally. The world, it seemed, was awakening to the birth of a radical notion, the equality of all humankind. At the heart of this global transformation stood Benjamin Franklin, a man whose wisdom transcended continents. In France, Franklin became an ambassador not just of a nation, but of an idea. His intellect, charm, and unshakable resolve won over even the most skeptical of French elites. Franklin was a living testament to the possibility of freedom, his presence a beacon of credibility for the American cause. The French monarchy, long disconnected from the people it ruled, could not match Franklin's moral authority. Here was a man who embodied the virtues of knowledge, humility, and purpose, qualities glaringly absent in Versailles. His influence spread beyond courtly chambers, inspiring thinkers and reformers across Europe. Even among France's allies and rivals, the message was clear: liberty was no longer a distant dream but an achievable reality. The Marquis de Lafayette, driven by a thirst for glory and ideals, became a symbol of this transatlantic revolution. He risked his life and status for a cause that was not his by birth but became his by conviction. Together with Franklin, Lafayette's commitment ignited hope not only for America but for the downtrodden of his homeland. The decisive defeat of England at Saratoga shifted the tides. France, once hesitant, now boldly aligned itself with the American Revolution. On February 6, 1778, the two nations forged a treaty of alliance, pledging mutual support in their fight for liberty. French heroes like de Grasse, Rochambeau, and Lafayette played pivotal roles in the eventual American victory. From the naval triumphs to the surrender of Cornwallis, France's involvement was indispensable. Yet, beneath these victories lay a cost that would shake the very foundation of France itself. Passy, Franklin's diplomatic headquarters, became the epicenter of a philosophical divide. The ideals of self-governance clashed with France's monarchical structure, exposing deep cracks in the old order. Necker, tasked with funding this war of ideals, borrowed vast sums, over 530 million livres in just 5 years. These loans, while critical to American independence, left France financially crippled. The monarchy, blind to its peril, dismissed Necker, its most competent financial mind. In doing so, it revealed a fatal flaw, a system driven by ego and short-term gain, incapable of long-term vision. Despite its sacrifices, France reaped little from its support of America. Instead, the war drained its treasury, weakened its army, and exposed the monarchy's inability to adapt. The people, however, found something far more valuable than material rewards. They found inspiration. The American Revolution showed the world that ideas could triumph over empires. The Americans seemed to have executed what our writers had conceived, one observer noted. This awakening set France ablaze with possibility as the ideals of liberty and equality took root in the collective consciousness. The heart of France began to beat with the rhythm of revolution. Philosophy transformed into action, and a nation long burdened by excess and missed opportunities began to stir. One voice captured the spirit of this moment. I was far from being the only one whose heart palpitated at the sound of the awakening of liberty, struggling to shake off the yoke of arbitrary power. France, a land of brilliance and contradiction, stood at a precipice. Its failures, now laid bare, became lessons for those bold enough to listen. Would it embrace this newfound wisdom or succumb to the weight of its past? History reminds us, great change begins not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of the people. The pen may write the laws, but it is the collective spirit that shapes a nation's destiny. France now faced a choice, to rise with the tide of liberty or be swept away by its force. Chapter 35, Death and the Philosophers. Voltaire's final act, The Lion in Winter. In 1774, at the age of 80, Voltaire was not merely surviving. He basked in the esteem of royalty, including Catherine the Great. Mortality, he knew, was as certain as taxation, and he embraced life with relentless vigor. Porcelain busts of Voltaire were in such demand that Ferney became a shrine to his enduring influence. His works resonated equally with the elite and the masses, securing his legacy. Madame Seward once remarked that in Voltaire's presence, she felt she stood before a god, cherished and adored. Imagine the weight of such a statement. When Voltaire arrived in Geneva, the adoration of his admirers nearly suffocated him. He carried forward the momentum of a life dedicated to influence and action. Even in his twilight years, Voltaire fought for progress with unyielding resolve. He envisioned a world where the poor who toiled would be enriched, Protestant marriages would be legitimized, and torture abolished. He dared to utter the word tolerance in an age rife with intolerance. Religious factions sought to silence him, but he pressed on, undeterred. Not even the wary surveillance of Louis XVI could curb his advocacy for change. Even as his ally, Turgot, fell from power, Voltaire turned personal challenges into triumphs, adopting a daughter, arranging her marriage, and remarking with characteristic wit, "My young lovers are a joy to see, They are working night and day to make a little philosopher for me." Age and adversity did not define him. He sought opportunities to expand his legacy. In his final drama, Irene, he quipped that he stood above the law like a king. The entire theatrical schedule was altered to accommodate his performance. When Voltaire decided to return to Paris, it was nothing short of a bold gamble. Upon entering, he remarked, "I believe there is nothing here contraband except myself." He arrived as a conqueror, proving that his authority remained unchallenged. The apotheosis, a grand comeback. Voltaire's Parisian residence became a hub of intellectual and political power. He entertained over 300 visitors, including Gluck, Turgot, and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin even sought his blessing for his grandson, to which Voltaire replied with regal simplicity, "My child, God and liberty, remember these two words." Yet Voltaire himself lamented, "I would be dead in 4 days if I had to live as a man of the world." The world, it seemed, had to adjust to his extraordinary presence. Clergymen schemed to convert him in his final days, but Voltaire remained steadfast in his beliefs. In a moment of both humor and defiance, he declared, "I am continually coughing blood. We must guard against mingling my blood with that of the good God." His independence of thought, even in the face of death, defined his greatness. At the Théâtre Français, as the audience chanted his name, an actor crowned him with a laurel wreath. When he attempted to pass the wreath to a lady, she refused, forcing its return to him. Voltaire joined the Freemasons, further cementing his network of influence. Despite physical decline, he continued to work tirelessly, consuming up to 25 cups of coffee a day to fuel his pursuits. Even in his final moments, his wit remained sharp, dismissing discussions of an afterlife with the exclamation, "In God's name, do not talk to me of that man." When Voltaire passed, his remains were smuggled out of Paris to evade watchful authorities. Even in death, his legacy commanded awe. Years later, his body was paraded through Paris in a triumphant procession, a demigod's final march. Voltaire's real legacy. Voltaire's influence transcended anti-church sentiment, reshaping society at every level. He exposed the flaws in outdated systems, advocating fairness, tolerance, and intellectual freedom. Without him, historians argue, figures like Gibbon might never have emerged. His efforts laid the groundwork for the French Revolution, though his moderate approach was later eclipsed by radicalism. By 1829, Voltaire's works had sold over 3 million copies. He bypassed the Reformation, taking France directly from the Renaissance into the Enlightenment. For those who face renewed battles for intellectual liberty, Voltaire's 99 volumes remain a source of inspiration, with not a dull page among them. The Death Parade, the final curtain for the Philosophers. Even the great minds who shaped the world are not immune to mortality. Diderot himself pondered bitterly whether it might have been better to die earlier, before the slow decay of purpose and passion set in. D'Alembert's decline mirrored this truth. His emotional attachment to Mille de l'Espinasse consumed him, and when he realized he was not her sole affection, his spirit crumbled. With no drive left, his work ceased, and he faded into obscurity. The same fate befell many of the Philosophers, brilliant figures who challenged systems but often failed to outlast them. Even Diderot, so vocal in his convictions, struggled to live by the ideals he espoused. In his later years, he became mired in past grievances, embroiled in defenses of old scandals instead of pursuing the present. His days were marked by complaints of age, his body failing, and his comforts reduced to the dull companionship of his wife. A final encounter with a priest did little to stir his soul. Diderot's rejection of the church was resolute. In a strange twist, his body vanished after death, leaving behind a legacy that felt both profound and incomplete. The stories of Mobley, Buffon, D'Holbach, and Raynal were strikingly similar, miserable endings marked by complaints and forgotten ambitions. Only Grimm seemed to grasp the futility of utopian dreams. Grimm understood a truth others ignored. Grand ideals crumble when they fail to account for human nature and the enduring weight of tradition. Revolutionary aftermath, the Philosophers' true impact. The revolution that followed was not a pure pursuit of liberty or morality, but a struggle for socio-economic reform. The philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment became tools wielded by factions seeking power. Phrases crafted by intellectuals were co-opted by revolutionaries to justify their agendas. For centuries, religion had propped up governments, instilling obedience and morality through fear of divine authority. The philosophers, particularly Voltaire, dismantled these ancient supports, exposing their irrational foundations. They did not seek to depose kings but to replace blind faith with reason, creating a new power structure rooted in logic. Louis XVI himself acknowledged these ideas, invoking natural law and the rights of man in his edicts. The American Revolution provided further momentum, igniting a global movement towards self-governance and individual rights. Yet the revolution spiraled beyond its original intent, descending into chaos as unbridled freedom clashed with the need for order. Even as the educated rose to power, the loss of tradition left society unmoored, struggling to balance newfound freedoms with stability. Chapter 36. On the Eve. Religion and the Revolution. The Catholic Church, a colossal landowner, controlled around 6% of France's land, amassing an annual income of 120 million livres, supplemented by another 123 million from tithes. This wealth, the Church claimed, was justified by its role in upholding family values, education, moral guidance, and social welfare. Yet, beneath the veneer of service to society, cracks in the foundation became evident. By 1789, the clergy, making up just 0.5% of the population, seemed increasingly out of step with the times. Monasteries, once brimming with purpose, stood abandoned, with numbers dwindling from 26,000 to 17,000. Some monks embraced the rising tide of new philosophical ideas, while others faced criticism for moral failings. The bishops, drawn mostly from the nobility, enjoyed lives of privilege and luxury, while parish priests struggled in poverty, a disparity that even troubled King Louis XVI. The Church's vast wealth, coupled with its tax exemptions, provoked resentment among the broader populace burdened by rising taxes and financial hardship. Even in urban centers, discontent with organized religion festered, driven more by the Church's economic role than theological differences. Alexis de Tocqueville observed that the Church, as a landowner and tithe collector, became a symbol of exploitation. The revolution was not merely political, it was also a revolt against entrenched religious institutions. By relying on secular powers for support, the Church inadvertently paved the way for a society where secular individuals would come to dominate state affairs. Life on the edge. The erosion of religious authority raised profound questions about moral order and social stability. Philosophers like Mobley reluctantly acknowledged the necessity of a moral framework to maintain order, even as they sought alternatives to traditional religion. Fontenelle, foreseeing the dangers of unchecked individualism, lamented, "I wish I could live 60 years more to see what universal infidelity, depravity, and dissolution of all ties would turn to." As wealth became more accessible, indulgence spread beyond the upper classes, accompanied by urban migration, rising crime, and widespread prostitution. Social norms, once upheld by rigid institutions, began to unravel. Gambling and decadence flourished, while literary figures like Lockelow and de Sade portrayed a society descending into nihilism, with morality reduced to self-interest. Yet amidst the chaos, figures like Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette championed modesty, philanthropy, and a simpler way of life. Philanthropy grew, albeit insufficient to address the systemic inequities plaguing the nation. The fight against slavery gained momentum, while egalitarian ideas reshaped manners and social customs. People sought a natural living ethos, abandoning corsets, embracing practicality, and finding solace in nature. But beneath this retreat to simplicity lay a society grappling with its own disintegration. The salonières. Amid this turbulence, salons became sanctuaries of intellect and refinement, largely steered by women who turned social gatherings into forums of meaningful discourse. Edward Gibbon marveled at the intellectual vibrancy in Parisian salons, where women often outshone men in conversation. As political tensions escalated, however, salon culture began to shift. One salonière remarked, "Such conversation is no longer the fashion. The crisis is too great. People do not care to play chess on the edge of a precipice. Chapter 37, The Anatomy of the Revolution, The Nobility and the Revolution. In 1784, France's population numbered over 24 million, most of whom were peasants. By 1789, among them stood a noble class of about 26,000, wielding power and privilege far beyond their numbers. Traditionally, the nobility claimed to serve society by managing agriculture, overseeing justice, and providing schools, hospitals, and charity. Yet, by this time, many of these duties had shifted to the government and local peasant institutions. This left the nobility as a relic, extracting wealth from society while offering little in return beyond military service. Even this service was undermined by an aristocratic hierarchy that favored lineage over merit, limiting high-ranking roles to those with at least 4 generations of noble blood. The result was a failing system, with noble estates often mismanaged, leaving vast tracts of land uncultivated. Many nobles themselves fell into poverty, some through incompetence, others through sheer misfortune. Impoverished nobles often petitioned the very government they claimed to serve for financial relief. While serfdom had largely faded, about 1 million serfs remained by 1789. King Louis XVI expressed a desire to free them, yet resistance delayed progress, leaving most to purchase or secure their own freedom. By then, roughly 95% of peasants were free, but still burdened by feudal dues, taxes, and an array of mandatory payments like fees to use a lord's fish pond. The nobility, desperate to maintain their income, raised these dues, often administering justice through their manorial courts to enforce such practices. Voltaire observed this oppression with sharp clarity, remarking that the church, the nobility, and the members of the parliament united against the common enemy, the people. The peasants, subjected to feudal obligations that could claim up to 10% of their produce, faced further depletion from church tithes of another 8 to 10%. At best, half their labor remained theirs, leaving them in perpetual hardship, as Jean Jaurès noted. If there had been no other abuse than the despicable remains of that feudal system, there would have been no need for revolt to heal the sore. Remarkably, some nobles acknowledged their failures. A few even renounced their privileges, with 30 nobles offering to relinquish their feudal rights a year before the revolution. Yet the division among nobles only heightened tensions, as the institution of nobility crumbled under its own weight. In their bid to weaken the king and preserve power, these same nobles unwittingly set the stage for the revolution. The National Assembly of 1789, led by the bourgeoisie, seized control of France, driven by forces the nobility themselves had unleashed, the peasants and the revolution. Resentment simmered, but the poorest peasants, too weak to act, often relied on wealthier farmers to lead resistance. When central authority faltered and local officials could no longer summon military support, the peasantry became a revolutionary force. They attacked chateaux, burned records of feudal obligations, and pressured the nobility into surrendering their privileges. Industry and the revolution. France's industrial landscape was in flux on the eve of the revolution. Mining alone employed thousands, powered by horses, steam engines, and human labor. Cities swelled with activity, with Paris housing 600,000 residents and becoming a hub of commerce. Yet urban conditions were dire, streets were filthy, and poverty loomed large. Workers were laid off en masse, pushing many to the brink of starvation. Strikes and riots erupted, driven by frustrations over bread shortages and appalling living conditions. While the urban masses provided the muscle of the revolution, they lacked political direction. Leadership and strategy came from the bourgeoisie, who channeled this energy into their broader goals. The bourgeoisie and the revolution. The bourgeoisie, France's rising business class, were both powerful and constrained. They controlled state finances, expanded trade, and amassed wealth, yet were stifled by tolls, tariffs, and a lack of political representation. Taxation weighed heavily on them, with numerous levies falling disproportionately on the Third Estate. Frustrated, the bourgeoisie sought not to dismantle the monarchy but to control it. They harnessed peasant discontent to abolish feudalism and urban unrest to challenge royal authority. In doing so, they secured their own dominance, reshaping France in their image. The gathering of forces. Revolutionary ideas and grievances intertwined to ignite the French Revolution. That economic disparity, political exclusion, and intellectual ferment created a volatile mix. The monarchy's weakness and a brutal famine in 1788-89 served as the final spark. When hunger broke the dikes of law and custom, a tidal wave of change swept through France. Chapter 38, The Political Debacle. The Diamond Necklace, 1785. Queen Marie Antoinette had earned a new, cutting title, Madame Deficit. To the growingly resentful French populace, she was no queen of elegance but a symbol of excess. Rumors swirled through the royal court like smoke, of her connection with Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count, and of her insatiable love for jewels. This scandalous reputation made her the perfect centerpiece for a plot that would rock the monarchy. A diamond necklace, valued at 1.6 million livres and originally designed for another royal mistress, Madame du Barry, became the bait. But when Marie Antoinette refused to buy it, jewelers found themselves stuck with their creation, setting the stage for a grand deception. Cardinal Prince Louis-René Edouard de Rohan, a powerful man yearning for royal favor. Desperate to win the Queen's trust, he fell into the web of Jeanne de la Motte Valois, a woman with fake claims to royal lineage. Using forged letters in the Queen's handwriting, Jeanne convinced the cardinal he was purchasing the necklace from Marie Antoinette. In truth, Jeanne took the jewels for herself. The unpaid jewelers, realizing they'd been duped, brought the scandal into public view. Though innocent, Marie Antoinette became the villain in the court of public opinion. She was branded a thief and a libertine, her reputation shredded beyond repair. Napoleon would later declare, "The Queen's death must be dated from the diamond necklace trial." For this moment began the irreversible unraveling of the monarchy. Colonna, 1783-87. In 1783, Charles Alexandre de Colonna became France's controller general, a man with a gift for delaying disaster. The treasury was nearly empty, yet his answer to mounting debt was extravagant spending. He gambled with the national lottery, financed projects for the elite, and inflated the royal household's expenses. For a time, his tactics masked the nation's financial doom. But by 1786, the truth could no longer be ignored. France's debt and deficit were insurmountable, and Colonna's solution was drastic, taxing the untouchable nobility and clergy. The reaction was swift and severe. The Assembly of Notables, once docile, turned against him, branding him reckless and irresponsible. When Colonna tried to appeal to public opinion, his own corruption, including illegal land sales, came to light. In 1787, under the Queen's advice, the king dismissed Colonna. He fled to England, to the Bastille. The final blow came on July 14, 1789. The people of Paris took up arms. In search of supplies, they stormed the Bastille, a fortress symbolic of oppression. After hours of bloody combat, the revolutionaries captured the governor and executed him. The king, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, recorded in his diary, July 14th, nothing. Yet this date marked the death of the old regime and the birth of a new era. When told of the uprising, Louis asked, "Is this a revolt?" "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution. France would never be the same." Envoy. We have just closed the book on the 18th century, an era whose echoes still resonate in our modern age. This was the age of the Industrial Revolution. Machines were no longer mere tools, they were engines of liberation, freeing humanity from the burdens of relentless labor. This revolution underscored a timeless truth: progress and technology are vital to elevating human life beyond the mere fight for survival. At the same time, the sciences transformed how we engaged with the natural world. No longer confined to abstract theories, science became a practical force, applying logic and cold reason. Philosophy, too, turned its gaze from lofty speculation to the grounded concerns of daily existence. The Church, seeking to shed the chains of superstition, pursued morality untethered from fear, bribery, or blind devotion. Governments wrestled with justice and efficiency, confronting the natural hierarchies that shape human society. In France, Voltaire and Rousseau waged a battle of reason, one championing rationality, the other the profound depths of emotion. These leaders, creators, and thinkers exemplified what it meant to forge a path rather than follow one. In salons across France and England, influential women shaped discourse, while powerful empresses held sway in Austria and Russia. This was an age that underscored the power of individuals to shape the destiny of nations. Will Durant saw history as a living drama. It was not a collection of lifeless documents but a seamless story. Durant believed history should not be fragmented into separate disciplines but written as it was lived, whole, interconnected, and vibrant. After 40 years of happy association in the pursuit of history, he acknowledged its close. Now that that day has come, we know that we shall miss the absorbing purpose that gave meaning and direction to our lives. And so, we thank you, the listener, for joining us on this journey. You were never an afterthought but a constant companion as we unraveled the threads of the past. Now, we bid you farewell, hopeful that the legacy of this work endures.